Welcome to the 31st meeting of this year of the Rural Affairs, Climate Change and Environment Committee, and members and the public should turn off their mobile phones, especially if they're noisy ones, but even if they're not, it can affect the sound system, so please do. Agenda item 1 today is a decision on taking business in private. The first item is for the committee to decide whether its consideration of its report on the Scottish Government's draft budget 2014-15 should be taken in private at future meetings. Are we all agreed? Agreed. We are agreed. Thank you very much. In that case, we move on to agenda item 2, which is subordinate legislation. Second item is for the committee to consider the negative instrument Town and Country Planning Marine Fish Farming Scotland Regulations 2013. Members should note that no motion to annul has been received in relation to this instrument, and I refer members to the paper. Is there any committee member wishes to discuss this just now? Claudia Beamish.
Thank you, Convener. I just wanted to highlight, I haven't put down a motion to annul, but I did want to just put down a marker of concern that has been expressed to me about the transparency of the broader audit and review process in relation to this, because it's only, as I understand it, SEPA, SNH, Marine Scotland Science and the relevant Salmon Fisheries Board that is actually consulted in that process, and it can lead to the permission to be permanent for a fish farm. So my concern would be about the lack of transparency, in my view, in that I would be more keen on it being a more public consultation. So I just wanted to put down that marker at this point, but I haven't put in any motion to annul, because it's not actually specifically the negative instrument, Convener. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any other comments on this just now? It would be possible for us to write to the Minister to ask if this process is one which is due for review or anything like that. And if the committee's agreed, we could do that just to sort of have a dialogue about this matter, about transparency and so on. Okay, are we agreed that we do not want to make any comments about in relation to this instrument? Therefore, thank you very much. Now move on to agenda item 3, the Scottish Government's draft Scottish Climate Change Adaptation Programme. For the third item today, the committee will take 2 roundtable evidence sessions. The first session concentrating on the natural environment and land use in the elements of the draft adaptation programme. And I welcome the witnesses today, who I think we will just get to introduce themselves round the table so that everybody knows who each are. The sound system is controlled automatically for those who haven't been here before, and therefore if you indicate to me that you want to speak, then I'll indicate to you when you can speak in this process. And if we start off beyond the official report, Jim Densham.
Thank you, Convener. Jim Densham from RSPB Scotland. I'm here representing Scottish Environment Link. We have a climate adaptation task force that looks into this sort of issue.
Thank you.
Morning, I'm Jane Baxter. I'm an MSP for Mid Scotland and Fife.
Hello, I'm Lynn Matheson. I'm the Agricultural Development Manager for Soil Association Scotland. I run the Future Proofing Scotland's farming programme for the Scottish Government and QMS, helping farmers look at climate change and the practical implications that we have on their farms.
Good morning, I'm Claudia Beamish, and I'm a MSP for South Scotland and Shadow Minister for Environment and Climate Change.
Hi, I'm Jo O'Hara. Since Monday, I've been Deputy Director in Forestry Commission.
Congratulations. Richard Lyle, I'm the MSP for Central Region.
Andrew Bauer from the National Farmers Union of Scotland.
Nigel Dawn, MSP for Angus North and the Mearns.
Ferguson, MSP for Galloway West Dumfries.
Gerard Aventall, Director of Conservation Services and Projects for the National Trust for Scotland.
Jim Hume, MSP for South Scotland.
Morning, Des Thompson, Principal Advisor on Biodiversity with Scottish Natural Heritage.
Morning, Angus MacDonald, MSP for Falkirk East.
David Pattison, Executive Director of the Marine Alliance for Science and Technology for Scotland.
I'm Graham Day, I'm the MSP for Angus South and the Deputy Convener of the Committee.
and as the convener, I'm the MSP for Caithness, Sutherland and Ross. So welcome everybody to this round table. We're going to kick off with issues related to biodiversity and land use. And if I may start the questions just now and see what response we get. What impact is climate change likely to have on Scotland's land, freshwater and marine environment over the short, medium and long term? No theses, please, but any incisive short comments from any of you at the moment. You know, what's the impact of climate change on each of these land, freshwater and marine environment in the short, medium and long term? Anyone want to kick off? Yes, indeed. We've got Professor Patterson.
In the short term, there will be few changes. The problem with this is it's a long-term problem. The short-term changes we're likely to see are extensions of species ranges and increase in numbers of invasive species. You can separate the kinds of impacts on estuarine and marine systems in terms of things we can monitor and help predict the effects of, such as temperature and ocean acidification. But it's very difficult to see an immediate adaptive strategy for those things. On the other hand, in terms of managing systems, integration between understanding of the land, the estuary and the sea is very important, so that the management strategies are dealt with across those borders, not simply within them. And under that context, support of local partnerships to help protect marine and coastal environments is critical. And it's those regions of interface, I think you'll see the fastest changes.
Okay, thank you. Des Thompson, and then
Thank you.
Terry.
Well, I support your remarks, and we're very lucky to have a growing evidence base on climate change report card produced for the UK. And I mean, what we are seeing now are more rapid changes in our seas, in our mountains, and the coast. I mean, changes that have never been witnessed before over a similar time frame. So given that we are seeing these changes in nature and biodiversity, we really do have to start tackling the challenges ahead.
Andrew Bauer.
From farming's point of view, the impacts are already here. It's not the short and medium and long term. They are here already. The growing seasons have changed. Farmers are already adapting what they're growing because of extreme weather events, making potentially higher profit crops more risky to plant. So this year, I think you've seen an increase in the areas of oats grown because they were shown to be, in the last few years, more resistant to flooding and things like that. That potentially floods the market, collapses the price. Farmers are seeing a lot of damage to farm infrastructure, and they're struggling to keep pace with the change at the moment, actually, because it's being talked of as something for the medium and long term, and actually it's here and now for them, and they are concerned about pests and diseases. There's big issues on the west coast now with liver fluke affecting cattle, and there's worries about things like black grass, which have caused huge problems to cropping in England, moving further north. So the impacts are already here, and more are on our doorstep.
Thank you. Terry Leventhal.
Well, thank you. In agreement with everything that's been said, there's a number of additional impacts that are with us and will probably increase in the short to medium term. First of all, I'm thinking the increase in the number of pathogens, and particularly plant pathogens, that we're beginning to see kind of enter into the system. Everybody will be aware of cholera. It's the first time I and Cobra have ever considered anything like that. But we have had incidents of Phytophthora ramorum with us over the past decade plus. We see the increase of these things happening all the time, and indeed, even within our routine monitoring within our building stock, we've seen an increase in the number of insect species hitherto we would not have seen, including the dreaded Guernsey carpet beetle, which is now arriving on our shores, so look out for that. The severe weather impacts, which have already been mentioned, is probably some of the things that we will have to kind of deal with. And I think that the most significant impact from what we've seen in terms of how we deal with it is the need for a change in the routine management and maintenance practices that we would need to undertake to prevent damage from occurring. You know, we've noticed the more that you can do a stitch in time, the less damage you have coming forward. But there's a whole change in both the psychology and the resourcing that needs to come in to help manage that and to help people put those measures in place.
We'll certainly explore those further. Jim Densham.
We certainly, from Scottish Environment Link, our members are seeing species and habitats being affected, and Professor Thompson's shown that document that brings together some of that information, which is really useful. And one thing I'd like to point out is, I guess, in summer 2012, I went on a sabbatical as part of my RSPB work to different RSPB reserves, really to look at what are some of the issues. And for many of the people who work on those reserves now, they're seeing everyday issues and impacts from many different sides, and perhaps not always being able to disentangle them from climate change. I think we will, in the future, and as decades go on, we will see those become much more clear as climate impacts. But when we talk to them and show them that there are issues that we know will come up in the future, things like heavier rainfall, more rainfall in the winter rather than the summer, things to do with more storms, issues to do with species movements, we saw that their stories did come out. Oh yes, we have seen this, we have seen that. So there are examples now that are happening that we can see in some of the most special places in Scotland. And
Lynn Matheson?
I'll just add to Andrew's point about the kind of extreme weather events and things like that we've had. We've obviously had flooding, we've had soil erosion and things like that, and looking at it from an agricultural point of view, that's our most valuable resource, and we have to look to actually maintaining that in good stead for the future if we're going to be growing our own crops and everything like that. And the fact that obviously fluke has become a serious problem in the last maybe 18 months, and become even more apparent with the bad winters and things like that, and bringing stock down. So I think that's one of the ones that has a great monetary value and welfare effect on our farming systems.
Thank you. Jo?
Yeah, and again, to support what everybody else is saying, I think with forestry, it's always said planting trees is a bit of an act of faith. So you have to take the short, medium and long term, because you're looking 50 years plus. And I think the biggest impact is a loss of certainty and a loss of confidence in the people to take decisions on their land and to take resilient decisions, and the confidence to not put all their eggs in one basket and to think about what the options are. So I think this term resilience, it's becoming, it's being used a lot, and I think we need to get to the next stage of, well, what do we mean by resilience? And I think that's resilience of ecosystems and of people who are making the decisions on managing those ecosystems. And I think probably with our experiences with Ramorum, particularly here, probably more than Callara, I mean, Ramorum, Phytophthora ramorum hitting the larch in the southwest is now. That's very much a short term. It's not only climate change, but climate change is exacerbating it, and we're just having to get much fleeter on our foot at responding to these things than maybe we have been for a couple of generations. So I think that, for us, I think that's probably one of the biggest impacts.
Claudia Beamish, want to raise some stuff there?
I think, Convener, it was more about the policy issues, which perhaps you want to ask the more broad question on. On that, or shall I just
do that?
Right,
yeah.
Thank you. I've begun to take a particular interest, not to rule out the land, but in marine and coastal issues, and I would be interested to hear from David Patterson and others who want to make a contribution in this regard about the contribution of these coastal communities and how that can help with climate change adaptation, and also the issues around the changes in our marine environment, about particularly has been highlighted to our committee, the feeding grounds for seabirds and any movement of fish populations, because obviously that's important for our fishing industry as well, and they have to prepare for that.
You go on, yes.
I'll try to respond
to a lot of points.
In terms of coastal communities, then I think support has to be given to the local partnerships who help to manage those systems. And I think there's a modern tendency to try and deal with that in a more holistic manner, which is to bring in stakeholders and have proper discussion. So if you look at some of the efforts that are going on, and you could pick out Shetland as perhaps an example, where stakeholders, policymakers and academics are getting together to decide on a strategy rather than imposing a strategy. That is first and absolutely critical. Clyde Partnership is another example, Fourth Partnership, etc. But there is a lack of strategic support for those partnerships. They've been done on a voluntary basis for quite a long time, and a lot of the coastal managers have, until very recently, lived very much hand to mouth. And with the formation of the river management boards, etc., I think it's made it slightly unclear who's responsible for what and how that can be supported. So if I could make a plea, it would be to look at that and give support where it might be due. The other issue is about fisheries. Now, I'm not a fisheries expert, but I'll give the best answer I can, is that fish populations will move in response to a number of factors. And it can be to do with top-down impacts, the impact of the fisheries itself, as we've seen. It can be to do with their food supply, and it can be to do with things like temperature and the thresholds for their particular climate space. So we must expect variation in the distribution of natural populations. And it comes back to Jim's point of separating climate change from natural variation. In order to do that, we need two things. We need data, and then we need to be able to use that data in a reliable manner, which means improving modelling. And it's the modelling and the material that goes into the modelling and the validation of those models that is critical. So I've given you a rubbish answer, and I accept that. And it's because we don't have a brilliant answer. But I'll give you another answer, which is much more pragmatic. If the fish move, the fishermen will move. They won't stay and fish for something. They'll either change their species or they'll move their distribution. And we've seen that with things like mackerel populations changing. So what can you do about that? You can collect the information to help predict where populations will be, and you can try and impose catch limitations, maximum sustainable yield, targeting gear within the context of climate change. And that's very difficult, but that's what we should be aiming for. I'm sorry if that is a bit rambling.
Des Thompson to add to that.
Well, thank you for the question. I wonder if I could just provide some data for the coast. There's some very important ongoing work involving SNH, SEPA, Historic Scotland, and Glasgow University, Jim Hansen at Glasgow University. And if you look at our coastal resource, about 70% is hard coast, but just under 30% is soft. Soft coast, much of it liable to erosion. And recent statistics are showing that around 18% of that soft coastline is highly susceptible to erosion. Now, with sea level rise, these are clearly areas that we need to target very carefully for action. Places like the Uist, like Orkney, some of the Firths. And it's to take a sort of proactive stance. Politically, you know, about 12 of our constituencies have these sort of sensitive areas. And it's trying to manage sea level rise. It's trying to manage the sediment deposition so that sort of new habitats form and become more resilient to climate change and support important wildlife, rather than wringing our hands and saying there's nothing we can do about it or putting hard coastal defences in place. So that figure really, I got that figure very recently, 18% highly susceptible to erosion. So we are getting figures coming out of modelling and equally from very important long-term monitoring that's been carried out.
Okay.
Can I
yes.
just ask a clarification?
Yeah.
The 18% that's just been referred to, is that 18% of the total of the coastline or 18% of the 30%?
18% of the 30%.
18% of the 30%. Thank you very much.
Okay. Well, can get more detail on that if we need it. Jim Densham.
follow up Des Thompson's points. As you perhaps know, we've trialled as RSPB some managed realignment work in Nig Bay, in the Cromarty Firth, and also work on the Inner Forth, which is a small scale at the moment, looking to provide, allow the tide to come in and allow salt marsh to recreate in that area. But we have a vision with partners for a much bigger area to try to solve some of these problems. I think one of the things is, and relating it to the adaptation programme that we have, is that we need to think much longer than the 5-year timescales that this programme is there for. We need to have policies like managed realignment, addressing sea level rise, which have a much longer vision, and also then the policies can be put in place and aligned to make sure that we're addressing those. So things like CAP reform and the SRDP coming up, and perhaps future iterations of the SRDP need to provide options which can help land managers perhaps turn their land into ones which can create buffer zones for sea level rise and reduce flooding, as well as many other benefits.
I could make a couple of comments about the difficulty of futurology and so on, but the arguments are taken on board. We've got another sub-question related to this just now.
If I may, Convener, and like Alec Ferguson, just for clarity, this committee was given evidence previously that whilst there clearly are sea level rise issues, that the land mass is also still rising as a consequence of the ice age. Is that correct? And if so, how do the two things balance out?
No, you're absolutely correct. But in terms of sea level rise, the figures I've got, we're exceeding the land mass rise by 1 to even up to 6 millimetres per annum.
It's useful to get on the record. So, healthy ecosystems in general, what role can they play in increasing Scotland's overall resilience to the impacts of climate change? Any further comments around that just now? Yes, David.
One small one is that the development of these buffer zones, in a sense, between the land and the sea, salt marshes, mudflats, sand dune systems, also capture carbon. So if you have the ability to enhance that area, then you are increasing carbon capture, especially during the building phase of these systems. And in terms of time scale, it takes about 8 years from the data we have before they're beginning to perform in the way that a natural salt marsh, for instance, would. So again, it's a long time scale thing, but it would be highly beneficial in a number of ways to biodiversity management, ecosystem function, to help retain those systems and restore some of them.
Could I ask Des Thompson about Nig Bay, where there has been such a process going on now for some years? What measurements do we have?
Well, in terms of, and Jim may wish to come in on this, I mean, in terms of the bird interest and the habitat interest, really spectacular improvements as a result of management, and this is an area that's been very heavily developed in the past. So it's absolutely right. There are many examples where if you manage the area well, you really reduce some of the other pressures on salt marsh and other coastal habitats, then you get an great increase in the invertebrate diversity and in the birds and other wildlife exploiting these areas.
David Patterson.
If I could just follow that up, NERC has funded work through the BESS programme, which is Biodiversity and Ecosystem Service Sustainability, which is supporting this kind of thing. And there are other regions in Scotland. There's a small funded programme by SNH for salt marsh restoration in the Eden Estuary, and we have data from that as well, which supports Des's comments.
Okay. I was talking about Nig Bay and Easter Ross, for those of you who are from further south. Right. To what extent could... well, sorry, Joe O'Hara, first of all, before I ask the next question.
I was just come back with some tree examples rather than the coastal ones. So we've got natural flood management, for example, in terms of you can manage the ecosystem so that they reduce the rate of runoff to limit downstream flooding. And if you've got a healthy functioning ecosystem and buffer areas around watercourses, often with trees in, then that can slow down, reduce the impact of flooding further downstream. And other examples might be shelter for stock as well, or even in urban environments, green infrastructure in the urban environment helping with temperature and humidity and air pollution levels within cities. So there's 3 examples.
That kind of anticipated the answer to the question I was just about to ask, but if anyone else wants to make a comment along those lines just now, Terry, first of all, and then...
Yeah. Well, I would suggest it's a truism that a healthy ecosystem is also a healthy community overall as well. I think that the challenge that's actually kind of presented by this is in defining what a healthy ecosystem is. and how you go about kind of achieving it when there will inevitably be a whole series of competing kind of demands. And I think that to date is what we've actually had is no effective forum or no necessarily constructive forum for actually having some of these debates in the long-term discussion. And as an example, and I'm sure many members around this kind of table will know, is as we've been seeking to kind of restore a whole series of habitats and ecosystems within the Marlodge estate, there have been other pressures and other tensions through other economic activity that have perhaps rendered that experiment somewhat more difficult than it might otherwise have been. And yes, excellent, good. I look forward to hearing the outcome of that. So it is about kind of understanding where you also have the tensions that lie underneath it, so that you can actually manage those.
And Lynn? Yes.
Just as looking at from a point of view of healthy ecosystems, and back to David's point about carbon sequestration and things like that, we're looking at we've quite well reported and documented evidence about organic farming sequestering carbon, and obviously the biodiversity values of organic farming and that kind of things. And also I'd like to add to Joe's comment about the woodland aspect. We've done a couple of events and it's been very informative for farmers and how they can work with fisheries and the woodland to reduce diffuse pollution and flooding further downstream, and how everybody can work together and holistically. It actually adds to the value of the community as well.
I was going to ask the question about, how can the policies and proposals set out in the draft adaptation programme go further in helping build the resilience of the ecosystems we're talking about? Jim Densham?
Perhaps I can try and answer a bit of both with that. As far as Scottish Environment Link, we're obviously very keen to see healthy ecosystems, not just because they are where biodiversity lives and our wildlife exists in healthy ecosystems, but because we know that ecosystems can provide services to people and to society and even to boost the economy. And so we do welcome in the programme that under the natural environment theme especially, that it's taken a less sectoral approach than the framework did, the previous iteration of the framework, into the objectives, and especially Objective N3, which talks about sustaining and enhancing the benefits, goods and services the natural environment provides. So it's that picture of, if we get a healthy ecosystem, it can provide the services that is needed to build a resilient Scotland, to build the resource base that we will all need in the future.
Do you think the structure of the adaptation programme as it is at the moment, with these three main headings and subheadings beyond, is a good structure then to help us focus on getting building, the resilience into the ecosystem?
Yes, definitely. I mean, I think it is a good structure to start with on a first adaptation programme, and we have worked with government to try and help them understand this and work with them to try and develop it. And yeah, we do welcome that approach, and we would like to see more than just an aim to aim for. We'd like to see how we get there. We'd like to see more of that put into the document. But the aim and the objectives and the outcomes are welcome.
Thank you for that. And Andrew Bauer.
I suppose I'd like to inject a slightly different note into the debate. I wouldn't disagree with anything that's been said there, but a couple of things to bear in mind. One is, as production becomes more challenging, and yes, climate change may bring some production benefits to Scotland, but undeniably, certainly in our more extensive areas, areas that are fit for production may decline, and we have to be careful that we ensure we don't export our problems to somewhere else in order to make sure that we have what we think is, on the face of it, the right set of benefits. We need to maintain that productive capacity and not simply rein that in and export everything overseas. I would also say that there's some fairly hard economic decisions that are going to have to be made in terms of agriculture. Natural flood management and tree planting are two things that have already been mentioned there. They have their place, but they can also be fantastically expensive, and we need to be very hard-nosed in the choices that we make. So perhaps in some areas floodplain storage is an appropriate solution, but in other areas that's going to wipe out huge amounts of productive capacity. We may wish to re-meander some rivers, but if it's costing hundreds of thousands of pounds per kilometre, then we may have to question whether or not that's in all situations the right thing to be doing. So I wouldn't disagree with anything that's been said, but we have to balance out the need for production and adaptation to climate change.
Des Thompson, and then a supplementary on that.
Just on the, you asked about Adaptation Scotland. I mean, thinking about peatlands, which we haven't talked about so far. Sure. I mean, for instance, the great work that's happening in the Flow Country. I mean, healthy ecosystems, of course, give us clean water, give us amazing wildlife. But looking beyond that, we can get tourism, we can get revived economy, all arising from this. But that sort of joined-up approach to managing that area and promoting that area will only happen if there is encouragement for different agencies and the business sectors to work together. So I think if there's a plea, it's to see the importance of healthy ecosystems promoted more widely and active encouragement for different organisations to work together to get the real public benefits of these thriving ecosystems. Because you can turn it on its head and think about some of these peatlands and think how awful the landscape would be if we didn't have healthy ecosystem. No one would want to go to these areas, no one would want to live in them, and they produce very little.
Well, we'll certainly take that into account. Graham Day has a question about this, I think, that's opposite at the moment.
Yeah, thank you, Convener. Thank you, Andrew Bauer, for providing an opening to ask a question. I've been looking for an opening to ask. It relates to climate change and agricultural practice. Can I seek the views of Andrew Bauer and the rest of the panel on the extent to which agricultural practice may be exacerbating the impact of climate change in terms of flooding? What I'm getting at is, for example, in my own constituency, I'm seeing examples during severe rainfall of significant runoff onto roads and into properties from fields where the crops have been sown in a direction that leads towards these, with no buffering, as it were, and also where there are examples of significant polytunnel developments. There's severe flooding development around there. I'm just wondering if these sort of agricultural practices are exacerbating the problem.
I can't rule out the possibility that they may be having an impact on the point about contour ploughing. That's certainly something that's been encouraged, but there is a practical problem. Once you get above a certain gradient, the health and safety risk to the farmer of ploughing across the field is significant, so it's not particularly attractive. If the farmer is cultivating a field with watercourses, then there are minimum distances that he can cultivate within those. There are obviously good practice distances beyond those, and we would like to think that where people feel that's appropriate, they'll try and do that. But there is the economic reality that they're trying to keep their businesses going in difficult times, and that's something that definitely factors into the equation. Polytunnels, yes, they I imagine would speed up the runoff, but again, the general binding rules and things like that would dictate minimum distances, cultivation distances close to watercourses. Roads are, yes, that could definitely have an impact. Turning it the other way, when we've seen extreme weather events, we quite often see the roads authorities merrily digging trenches that then flood the entire field and wipe out areas of crop. So, I'm not pretending we're angels, but there is a lot that's being done. Scottish farming, certainly in terms of diffuse pollution, has been acknowledged as in working with SEPA, having a European exemplar in tackling that problem. On flooding, there's probably a long way to go, but I sense an appetite from our members to do something about it. What I also sense is a degree of inertia in the public bodies about practical examples on the ground beyond very, very small pilot studies. I think if the initiatives and the advice was there and was fit for purpose, there would be a lot of farmers that would be looking at that as a serious economic consideration. Do I plant that area or with a high value crop that's potentially at risk, or do I plant it with a lower value crop and enter into an agreement that that's going to be floodplain storage? But at the moment, the knowledge transfer and the financial incentives are just not there. We've been calling for them for, well, as long as I've been in this job. There does seem to be a real timidity about doing something on a scale that will make a real difference.
Lynn Matheson.
Just to add to that, I was at SRUC meeting last week about nutrient management and innovation, and I believe, I think on the 12th of November, SEPA and the government and the NFUS and that are working together on a thing called Mind the Gap, which is reiterating to farmers about distances, and so there wouldn't be problems with diffuse pollution and that type of thing as well. And getting back to the fact that what you're talking about, flooding and soil getting on the road and everything like that, I think that we have to get back to realising that it's a valuable resource. Yes, it causes problems and everything like that, but that's your livelihood that's getting washed onto the road and down a burn and causing problems for the fisheries guys and becoming a pollutant and everything like that. So looking at the agriculture industry as a whole, and the forestry as well, because obviously when you're felling trees and everything like that, it has an impact, that is a valuable resource. You really don't want it going anywhere else. You want it in your fields to grow your crops. So whether it be a case of that we look at reiterating that as a valuable asset, and the fact that you don't leave it as bare ground up until the point, obviously you have to sow crops and everything like that, but at what point do you make it bare ground to sow that crop?
That we could explore in a little more detail, but we're going to look at, yes?
I'll just come in with a brief,
and then
it's actually to Mr Densham.
Please do, and then a forestry question,
right.
But part of it.
No, I just wanted to clarify. Sorry, I'm not trying to cross-examine you here, Mr Densham, but
why not?
Well, maybe I will. No, you did say in your introductory remarks, I think, that you are representing Environment Link here as well. And I think I'm right in saying you pronounced yourself broadly satisfied with the overall structure of the adaptation policy as it's laid out. And I just wanted to, because Link have sent us a briefing, which is in some ways quite critical of the adaptation policy, and I just wondered if you could clarify your position on that, perhaps. With your Link hat on, perhaps.
Yes, So I'm trying to represent Link as much as we're abroad, with many organisations. But we mustn't be churlish. We must say that the government has made good strides in taking forward what was the existing framework and developing what is there. And as I said, the structure that we see on one of the on the introductory part of the adaptation programme is good. We welcome that. We welcome the step forward away from a very sectoral approach. So farming here, forestry here, homes and businesses here. So it's starting to become more of an integrated package. We would like to see that happen more, and we do want to see certain other improvements. So, for example, I've talked about already that we need to look beyond a 5-year programme. That's the minimum. That's what the Climate Change Act, I think, says, that we must have a 5-year programme of objectives, proposals and policies. But that gives us quite a strict and short-term look at what we need to do. I think we need to have something either as part of and described in the programme, or without that, to say where are we going with Scotland? How do we get to the aim? How do we get to the resilient Scotland that is adaptable? Because that doesn't quite come across in the programme as it is in draft. And we do welcome again that there are many policies and proposals. So government has gone to each of its different departments and said, what in your programmes and in your policies are adaptation will help us build resilience, and what can be tweaked and what can be changed to make it more so. But we want to see, if possible, more policies, more things that are fitting into that overall vision, that much bigger approach to making Scotland resilient, a more holistic look at adaptation as a whole. So I think there's a bigger debate really that hopefully the committee can kick off and we can take forward. This being the first 5-year programme.
Okay, that's useful. Thank you from my point of view. Well, forestry.
But yeah, one of the questions I think has been answered, but
well, indeed it has. But I wonder if I could just expand on the forestry sector, convener. Thank you. And perhaps in doing so, I should take this opportunity to welcome Joe O'Hara to her position as Deputy Director of Forestry Commission Scotland and wish you every success in that post. Obviously, climate change is going to have a major impact on the temperature that we all live in, the rainfall levels that we all experience, and wind levels and all of those type of things, all of which are hugely influential on the forestry sector. And I just wondered if you could expand a little bit on what work has been done to identify the likely impact of climate change, if it continues at the current rate, on the forestry sector, and how the forestry sector might adapt to these challenges.
Okay, I'll do what I can.
And I appreciate after 3 days.
I have
that's
some
a bit
briefing
tough.
with me. Yes, I think, and this has been very much developing science, I think, as the different IPCC reports have come out, each with different degrees of certainty about what's going to happen in the future, and about, you know, in the early days saying, this is what will happen, and we all talked about global warming, and then it's like, well, actually, some places might be warming, some places might be cooling, and it's much more complicated than that. And then it moved, and I think what the trajectory has gone, as I think I said in my opening remarks, is actually all we know is the future is going to be different. And it's likely to be different in a certain direction. And you're quite right, the three key risks that have been identified is to do with wind, pests and diseases, and to some extent fire as well, which hasn't been mentioned yet. So there has been work done on that. I know forest research one of the objectives in here is to look at being much more spatially explicit about this, because one of the problems we've had with the models is that they make general statements about Scotland or about the east of Scotland, west of Scotland. For individual land managers making decisions about what they're going to plant, what silvicultural practice they're going to use, we need to be a bit tighter than that. Until we have that certainty, and I'm a bit sceptical about just how certain models can ever give you, just because of how chaotic the climatic system is, it's about like I said earlier, don't put all your eggs in one basket. What we're trying to encourage people to do is take a more diverse approach. We're looking at the use of different provenances, different species maybe that we've not really used very much in Scotland before, because all of them are being hit. I suppose I don't know, Sitka survived so far, but we can't anticipate that Sitka is going to go on forever and ever and not be touched by an incoming pest or disease. So I think the thing is we are going to have to learn to live with uncertainty in forestry going forward. We're going to have to plan for it, and that means we have to build diversity in, and that's in structure, species, composition, and the way that we manage. And I think that's where the focus of the research is. And the other element I'd like to point out is the opening of the Queen Elizabeth Forest Park, Research Forest last week, and the use of the public forest estate to explore different approaches in this, because it is new and forestry takes a long time to change. So I think that focus seems a very sensible one as well, and using the public forest estate in that way.
Thank you very much for that, and I absolutely share that view. As one who lives in Galloway, right in the heart of, the visual impact of Remorum is absolutely horrendous. And I just wonder, you say quite rightly, this may involve bringing in new species that will work better in the climate that we may have ahead of us. Does that not also embrace a danger that, because one of the problems is we've been importing nursery stock, bringing disease with it? How do you see us combating the likelihood of bringing in diseases with new species? I think, I don't know what the normal English word for it is, but the phytosanitary arrangements for nursery stock, so the hygiene around your management of nursery stock, is a slightly separate issue, because if you practice very good plant health management and seed management and nursery stock and soil management regime, then you can get clean, disease-free stock of any kind of species, and then you can grow it in nurseries locally. So I think I would maybe separate the importation of nursery stock from the introduction of new species, because it's a slightly different issue. Thank you very much for that. Thank you.
Okay. Moving on to food supply and agriculture after... Sorry, Jim Hume, first of all, I think. Did you have something on forestry?
No,
if not, you can go on to...
Well, maybe I could just add slightly to it. One, it was partly the question before regarding the fact that a lot of the nursery stock is actually imported from some of the low countries and can carry disease. Therefore, that's why we're seeing such rapid spreads of things like ash dieback, etc. But also, you mentioned about more diversity. Of course, when you have large monoculture blocks, which has been the habit in the past and is still very prevalent across Scotland, if you get a disease in there, it spreads like wildfire. So are we hinting here at Forestry Commission being more strict about having more diverse species of food? I know we have to a large extent be commercial, of course, but are we starting to talk about perhaps intermingling species within blocks of commercial forestry?
I don't think it's a question of the Forestry Commission becoming strict. It's about working with landowners so that they are fully aware of the risks both to themselves and to their surroundings going forward, because they're investing now looking for, even if it's in a commercial sense, to get a return. And if they plant all one species, that's a huge risk to that return. So I think there's as much in this about the profession developing its ideas about forest design. We know there are ways of designing forests to build more diversity in without having a massive impact on the bottom line, as long as your baseline isn't 100% monoculture of Sitka spruce grown over perfect conditions that we might have experienced previously. So that can't be your baseline that you take your economic assumption from.
Okay, thanks.
Claudia?
I'd just like to ask a brief supplementary on that might be possibly answered by yourself, Joe, or by Andrew Bauer, and that is about agroforestry, which has been drawn to my attention, and I'm wondering the degree to which, in relation to our discussions today about climate change adaptation, about the relevance of that, because it does seem to have some good, positive outcomes.
Yeah, I was a member of the Woodland Expansion Advisory Group with a different hat on, and there was some really good evidence about the various forms of agriculture and integrating more farming and forestry for the benefit of both sides. I think agroforestry, in its more technical side about the very intense intermingling of crops and trees in Scotland, is very new, and I think that there is research ongoing, and I know there's discussions about it in the context of the next SRDP. As far as mingling of stock and trees, I think we're probably on more comfortable territory, and there is a way, there are options in there for, I think it's silvipastoral systems that are being looked at. So, yes, I think there is something in that from our perspective.
Yeah, I think the kind of systems that you've described there would be, and things like riparian planting alongside watercourses, are probably more attractive and less perceived as less of a threat to agricultural production by the farmers themselves than large-scale reversion to forestry. And there has been obviously a huge amount of debate about woodland expansion, some of the targets that were set, and farmers feeling that this is going to lead in some cases it has led to reversion of almost entire farms to forestry, and that's caused a lot of problems. So perhaps if we can get a little bit smarter and be looking for pockets of forestry or agroforestry systems intermingling the two, then we are more likely to get farmers on side, and we're going to see probably greater uptake.
I'd just like to add to that, purely on the fact that about a fortnight ago we held 2 events on agroforestry, part of my programme, Future Proofing Scotland's Farming, and our new innovation programme as well. And we brought somebody that actually is practically doing it on the ground with a silvo-arable situation, and we looked at silvopastoral as well. Again, getting back to the reason he did it was he was losing soil off his ground. So what they've done is 27 metre centres, so he can still get his big combine up the middle, but he's growing apple trees, so he has a crop worth £1,000 a tonne in there. So he's actually using both the height and below ground, and there's quite good figures on that basis. And the person we had up was Stephen Briggs, who's done a Nuffield scholarship on it. So we brought him up to Glensock and to Falkland Estate in Fife. It was very well attended by farmers and people interested in taking this forward in the future, especially I suppose because it's Article 22 and it might be taken forward as a scheme in the future.
I may get some of the details because we were going to talk about better climate and so on just in a wee while, but without repeating ourselves and trying to keep new information flowing. Moving on to the land use and food regarding agriculture, in this case, Jim.
Yes, thank you, Convener. Andrew Bauer's already mentioned things like changing in cropping and perhaps more oats happening already, or are more oats happening, and also the fact that there may be some production benefits. I'd just like to explore what the panel's views are on the benefits and also the threats and opportunities, of course, that climate change presents regarding food supply and agriculture in Scotland.
Well, I'm not a climate change scientist. I'm not going to pretend that I, got this crystal ball in front of me. But we can foresee the benefits, and they will be there. But what is potentially going to wipe all of them out is that uncertainty. 1 year in 5 you might be okay, but for the other 4 years you might be totally wiped out and suffer significant problems. And even this year, whether it's climate change or not, we've had a good summer, but we had a terrible beginning to the year. So yields have been nowhere near where the general public might perceive them to be. So yes, there would be benefits, but I think it's, we can't gamble on those benefits outweighing the problems that we're going to face. And that's going to be a challenging message for us to some of our members and some farmers out there, because they will say, well, if the climate's going to be warmer, then I'm going to have more options for what I can grow. And it's a complex message to communicate to farmers as it is to the general public. So, I'm not banking my house on the benefits, sorting it and outweighing all the negatives that we have to deal with there.
Matheson.
May I ask a question whether your food security also includes aquaculture in this case?
We can do, but we should do probably. But if there's other bits on the land part, first of all, then we can come back to aquaculture in a minute. Lynn Matheson?
Just to say that, back to what Andrew says, the fact that people are dealing with it now, and the fact that we're trying to get across variety choice and what actually might, and look at it as a holistic approach. We use the James Hutton's information as part of our events and things like that, just to show how land will actually change, but take it holistically and say, yes, right, you're going to get better summers and everything like that. But you have to look at the whole broad approach, to the fact that you're going to have to change maybe what you grow, when you grow it, and the research and that has to be involved in actually bringing new varieties to the fore that have a shorter growing season and things like that. So just making people aware that they might have to change now. Same with stock and that kind of thing, looking at what type of stock and that they've got on the ground.
Andrew Bauer again.
Another thing to bear in mind is, increasingly farming, in some sectors this has been there for a long time, but they're operating in a global market, whether it be for fertiliser or feed or these other kind of things. So, yes, we might have a benefit here, but any saving you might make or any increased yield that you might gain could be easily wiped out by an increase in fertiliser prices, an increase in feed prices, or a lack of availability of these products. So that volatility, that uncertainty is a real challenge.
You got any follow-up to that?
No, that's fine.
Okay. Graham D.
Sorry, unless...
sorry, we'll come back to aquaculture in a minute. We'll deal with the land stuff first, yeah.
Yeah, perhaps we could sort of mix the two, conveners. I just sort of wanted to develop this point about what do we need to do to build resilience into our agriculture and aquaculture related food systems, and what in a practical sense should we be doing to tackle the impact of climate change?
You want to? Right, Andrew Bauer first, and then Terry Levington.
If I think about your own constituency in that area, there's quite a lot of intensive agriculture. There's been arable and soft fruit and field vegetables and things like that. There has been some work out of the James Hutton Institute that indicates that Angus, Fife, some of these areas where there are short coastal rivers with a warming climate will be more prone to drought. So we need to be encouraging via things like the controlled activities regulations. We need to be taking cost and restrictions out of farmers doing more offline storage and winter storage of water. So they take that and they build it into reservoirs, but you need tax breaks, you need better regulation in that area so that what is potentially a £200,000, £300,000 investment suddenly becomes within their reach, but it means you're taking the water during the winter when there's less of a problem. And in the summer, this summer we were in discussion with SEPA, we probably came within a week of restrictions being put on irrigation in certain parts of the country. So the impacts are here now. There are things like some of those are devolved, some of those are reserved, but we really need to be thinking collectively about that. Knowledge transfer, things like Lynn's programme, Farming for Better Climate are absolutely essential. The SRDP will play an important role as well, but I think we need to be talking to farmers about this in a practical way. There's been a lot of discussion about projections and modelling and uncertainty and everything like that. That's, I'm not taking away from that, but farmers are not particularly interested in that, to be blunt. They want to know, what do I need to do in order to retain my farm in good condition, continue to produce food, help my neighbours, help my local community. So we need to be giving them the practical steer now and making the decisions and putting in place the incentives and facilitating things so that it makes it easier for them to make those changes. Because right now, it's too complicated, there's too much noise, and for a lot of them, they're just shutting off.
First of all, Lynn Matheson.
I'd just like to say thanks very much, that we're absolutely necessary. It's nice to know that farmers will always adapt to what they need to do, but as Andrew says, we need to give them the knowledge to do that. As he says, our programme, the Future Proofing one and SAC's one, is doing that practically on the ground, and that's where you have to be. Again, SRDP will nudge them in that direction on what they want to do, but I think actually having them on the ground, seeing what other people are doing and what's achievable, and I've seen it for the last kind of 5 years that I've been doing this, I think it's on the ground stuff that needs to be happening.
Next.
Okay, this is kind of tough to put this into a couple of succinct sentences, but I'm going to try. The aquaculture industry is increasingly important in Scotland. We have the environment that potentially allows the development of that industry. In terms of climate change, there will be challenges to that industry which are exacerbated. And you can think of things like sea lice, amoebic gill disease, harmful algal blooms, escapes, etc. So you need to look at all of those things together. In order to promote the aquaculture industry, but also maintain the welfare of the species, it needs a joined-up approach. I think in terms of policy and legislation, it is quite difficult to establish new areas for aquaculture. That might be something to be looked at. The way that welfare is protected, the move away from pharmaceutical controls towards things like natural controls, RAS, controls of sea lice, etc., could be promoted. And also the engineering and technology to help move aquaculture offshore, where there are fewer impacts because of higher current flows, etc. Now, that is mentioned a little bit in the policy, but it doesn't seem to me to be joined up overall over a whole impact economy production cycle. And it seems that there's a little bit piecemeal in that. But if you look at the figures, then you see that aquaculture is becoming more important than capture fisheries, or at least balanced with capture fisheries. And Scotland has huge potential to develop along those lines. So I would not want to lose sight of aquaculture in Scotland as being a critical thing to support and follow.
We've got several other people lined up. Terry Leventhal, first of all.
Simply, thank you very much, Convener. To come back to a point I've raised already, simply put, it's kind of easier to react to an impact than it is to resource its prevention. And I think if there's actually a message that I would bring, it's about how the climate change adaptation strategy can help resource the mitigation. That's the critical kind of aspect to it. And we've mentioned programmes like SRDP and CAP reform in the context of this. And if we wish to use those programmes to help, then they must be made much more user-friendly and adaptable, because it's a bureaucratic nightmare to try and use those sources of funds to actually do positive things.
Jim Densham.
Yeah, I agree with what's been said, especially what Andrew's been saying, that we need, in a way, we need that bigger conversation to then decide, to help us all to understand where we're going, and say, well, how do the incentives need to be arranged, and the advice that we all need. And I think one of the things that, to point out from the document, the draft programme, is that it was quite poor on some of the agriculture policies that were listed by saying, say, for example, N31, which says implement the EU reform of the Common Agriculture Policy, with not much more detail to it. Just implementing CAP policy doesn't necessarily get you a more resilient Scotland. We need to understand much more about what does that mean. Are we talking about greening, SRDP? Which elements of SRDP need to be altered and changed, and which other parts of it? Do we need a bigger discussion about sustainable food systems for the future? Those are the sort of things that we need to start now to discuss and get consensus on, because we don't want farmers to be out of business because we haven't thought about some of the risks that are going to be taking place in the future.
Just as a point of interest, I think that the Cabinet Secretary made it very plain that the greening arrangements in the CAP were not meeting the climate change targets that he hoped they would. So I guess the policy document was written in the context of the government wanting to make sure that greening in the CAP was actually going to be effective in this way. But we'll ask him about that and take your point on board. Claudia Beamish and then Des Thomas.
Thank you, Convener. It actually follows on from the remarks that Jim was making, and it is about the future of our resilient, sustainable food systems. And I wanted to highlight that Nourish Scotland, a new charity, has said that there are concerns from their perspective, and indeed I have concerns about how we have a resilient food production process that, in my view, and this is just my own view, and I wonder what other panel members think, should be local, and possibly there should be shorter supply chains so that that resilience is built in. How can we support those things as policymakers? And I have a particular concern about that because at the other end of that are the people who you, Andrew, said, you wanted to help the communities as well, but communities in urban areas as well, and access to food. And I think this is a climate change issue to some degree, so I wonder if there are comments on that, because it's really a social justice issue as well.
Again, I think I'd turn to the idea of diversity. In some circumstances, those local food chains and things like that are absolutely appropriate there, and we would be happy to be part of that process. But there are other industries where the commodities that are produced here are part of a global supply chain, and that's not at all where we want to go. How you do that? The supermarkets are obviously major players in all of this, and they're not going to go away. And I don't think we should be wishing them to go away. I think we should be wishing them to perform better in some of these regards. But I've had conversations with Nourish Scotland, and they clearly have some very strongly held views about what they'd like to see. It's going to be an individual farmer's decision about whether or not he wants to engage in that particular way. Some farmers sell some product through farmers' markets. Is that the most efficient way to do it? No, it's not, but they've made a decision to diversify in that area, and it's working for some, it's not working for others. Others are feed into a processing supply chain, and they have no interest in that. I guess public procurement, things like that, needs to get behind these ideas if the government decides that's where it wants to go. And then farmers have the certainty that if I'm supplying into that local supply chain, the demand will be there, the systems will be able to handle what I produce, and I will make a reasonable return on the product, because they're not going to do it out of charity.
You know that. Lynn, Matheson and...
Just on the basis of looking at local and unprocessed and organic, we have a programme called Food for Life that's supported by the government, and has come on leaps and bounds in the last kind of 18 months that we've got new funding in that for it. And that looks at schools, it looks at all aspects of catering, and as I say, the figures that I keep hearing every time I come into the office about how many meals are now under that banner and things like that in East Ayrshire and the Highlands and Islands and everything like that is absolutely fantastic. And that's building again, and we have obviously contact with Edinburgh as well that's come through Food for Life.
Right, this is eating into our time. It is very useful to have these on the record. But Des Thompson.
Well, I'm just struck in particular by what Andrew and Joe have said, just the sort of rapidity of changes we're facing here, disease, pathogens, globalisation, public attitudes and perceptions. And really just making sure that we're supporting the research community to provide us with the answers. And knowledge exchange has been mentioned. I mean, we're incredibly fortunate having SRUC and James Hutton Institute, world-leading research capabilities. But unless we have that step change in recognising these are rapid, risky things that are being thrown at our environment now, unless we've got the science in place and the innovative techniques in place to try and combat these, we'll just be folding our arms as these changes happen. So we've got to make sure we have these connections between the science and the land users and land managers.
Which leads, I think, into our last question in this session.
Just a quick question, I think really it'll get a quick answer. Is the practical experience from initiatives like Farming for a Better Climate and Future-Proofing Scotland's Farming sufficiently reflected in the draft adaptation programme?
Andrew Bauer?
Farming for Better Climate, I think, deserves greater prominence. We think it deserves greater resources. Not only will it help Scottish farming, adapt to climate change, but it potentially gives us something that can develop as a brand Scotland in international markets. The Irish have done it very successfully through something called Origin Green. And I think we should be looking to them and learning some lessons. But, you know, knowledge transfer is a good investment, and I don't think Farming for Better Climate yet has the resources that it really needs. As I said the last time I came before this committee, the investment per farmer in Scotland in knowledge transfer on climate change is low, very, very low. And just like the general public, it takes time for these messages to get across. The difference is they have this large asset, land, which they are putting inputs into and creating outputs. So their potential, their individual potential to make a positive impact in terms of mitigation and adaptation is so much greater than the average man or woman in the street. So we need to acknowledge that and put those resources into them.
And Jim Densham? Sorry.
Yeah, just quickly, Convener, that obviously, as we know, mitigation is still the popular topic, and that is reflected in Farming for Better Climate, as we understand. And obviously, we also recognise that it does need more resources and more dissemination to the farming public, or to the public and to the farmers, to say, you know, it's about adaptation too, it's about how we adapt. Because we know that adaptation will happen, it's just we need to make sure it happens in the right way so they don't get negative impacts on many, many aspects of what's in the countryside.
What negative impact, just briefly?
So briefly, for example, you know, the climate projections show that land availability or suitability for agriculture may move up the hill, if you see what I mean. So that, and we must make sure that that sort of land is not simplistically ploughed up or used without considering the many benefits that is already using, you know, for example, for biodiversity.
Thank you. And Lynn Matheson?
Just to reiterate what, obviously, because I run Future-Proofing Scotland's Farm, and I can actually see what it's done in the last, we had climate change programme before that. We're 2/3 of the way through Future-Proofing Scotland's Farming. Funding comes to an end next August. But as we go, we evaluate 6 months on from there, and we've got chapter and verse from farmers of what they've done and the impact it's made in their business. And we've looked and recently visited a farm on the basis that he said he attended one of our events and it changed what he did in his farm. So we went to see what he'd changed in his farm and took 20 or 30 farmers along there. So it is having an impact on what's happening on the ground, and if we can resource it as well, that would be even better.
Right. Well, I think that's a pretty... David wants a final...
Just one final thing is, I appreciated Des's comments, and I think it applies to everything we've said today, is that there is a wealth of information in Scotland, and Scotland is actually small enough that we can coordinate across the different areas, perhaps better than some larger countries. And so just make it a plea to look to all of what we have available in terms of information. And what I didn't see in the policy was links to the higher education sector, which might be used to draw in some of the evidence you need without spending a lot more money.
We've had a good look at the natural environment and its capacity for adaptation just now, and it provides the members of this committee with quite a lot to think about to sharpen up the way in which this adaptation policy is going to be finally written. So I'd like to thank our witnesses just now for their evidence. It will give us, as I say, food for thought, and you can expect it will be reflected in our report. If you wish, as witnesses, to stay and watch the proceedings of the next session, of course you're very welcome to do so, but thank you for being here. We'll take a short break to change over, and then we'll move on to the next item. Thank you. Session of this just now, please. Agenda item 3. This involves a second round table of evidence on the Scottish Government's draft Scottish Climate Change Adaptation Programme, and the committee will focus on infrastructure and society aspects of that programme. And I welcome the new members of our panel. And as with the last one, I will ask people to go round and introduce themselves briefly, please, after the official report yourself. We're talking about Paula. Yes.
Good morning. Hello. My name is Paula Charlson. I'm Head of Environmental Strategy for the Scottish Environment Protection Agency. So part of my role is to drive the strategic direction, including helping Scotland to combat climate change.
Thank you.
Morning, my name is Jane Baxter. I'm an MSP for Mid Scotland and Fife.
Good morning, my name is David Goodhue. I'm the Director of Operations for the Scottish Fire and Rescue Service.
Good morning, it's Claudia Beamish and I'm South Scotland MSP and a Shadow Minister for Climate Change.
I'm Andrew Lugolinski. I worked for 27 years for General Accident Insurance, which is now part of Aviva. And recently I have served on the Royal Society of Edinburgh's inquiry into climate change. And also I was in the Adaptation subcommittee of the UK's Climate Change Committee for the first 3 years of its existence.
Morning, I'm Richard Lyle, MSP for Central Region.
Good morning, I'm Anna Beswick. I'm the Programme Manager for the Climate Ready Clyde project and also for the Adaptation Scotland programme.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Nigel Don, MSP for Angus North and the Mearns.
Morning, Chris Wood G. I'm the Sustainable Development Team Leader for Dumfries and Galloway Council, but here representing Sustainable Scotland Network, where I'm one of the climate change portfolio holders.
Thank you. Alex Ferguson, I'm still the MSP for Galloway and West Dumfries.
Good morning, I'm Stephen Thompson. I'm the Head of Environment and Sustainability for Transport Scotland.
Jim Hume, MSP for South Scotland.
Gavin Hewitt, Scotch Whisky Association, but also Sustainability Champion for Scotland Food and Drink.
Good morning, Angus MacDonald, MSP for Falkirk East.
Good morning, my name is Gordon McGregor from Scottish Power, and I'm here representing the 2020 Climate Group, which is a group of organisations in different sectors trying to meet the Scottish climate targets for, surprisingly, 2020.
Good morning, I'm Graham Dem, the MSP for Angus South, and I'm the Deputy Convener of the Committee.
And as the convener, I'm the MSP for Caithness, Sutherland and Ross. Looking straight at emergency responses and coordination, we're going to kick off with flood issues, and Dick Lyle has a question for you.
Thank you, convener. I note in 2008 the Scottish Government renamed the Scottish Government's Fire and Rescue Contingency Division as the Scottish Resilience. Changes in the climate, such as increase in number and severity of extreme weather events, are set to have a significant impact for the emergency services. What, in your opinion, can the panel ask, what has been learnt from the experience of the emergency response to recent major flooding events?
So just indicate if you wish, and then I'll call in people in turn. Don't want to start off with transport, do we, by any chance? Stephen Thompson.
We recognise that flooding is arguably the greatest risk that Scotland faces, at least from a transport perspective. And we solely believe that as transport offering the corridors or the connections within Scotland, if those connections go down, then there's an intrinsic link into not just the emergency services, but all of the sectors that are covered in the adaptation programme. So whilst we don't implicitly make reference to individual sectors within the transport element of the adaptation programme, we're very aware that without the transport corridors operating fully in Scotland, services like the fire and rescue are certainly going to suffer.
Paula?
Yes, thank you. I mean, as you'll know, one of the roles of SEPA is to administer the flood warning scheme for Scotland, and we do that, of course, with partners, with local authorities, but of course with emergency services and with the Met Office. And I think one of the roles that we have there is to try and improve that flood warning so that you can get more information and more information earlier, so that we can respond, and the emergency services can respond earlier to predicted flooding events.
Anyone else want to say something on this particular point? Yes.
Just from the perspective of the energy industry, I think over a number of years, flooding has become more prevalent as an issue and a risk. And there are three things, I think, that are important in our sector. The first is for new infrastructure, when it's designed and built, it does have flooding as a consideration as part of the design. The second is for existing assets on the ground, greater effort has been made to kind of flood-proof them to the best of their abilities. And work goes on in some of the regulated industries, the regulated sector, and in some other assets. And the third aspect is there is a greater monitoring and responsiveness within the sector, and I think that's right across industry as well, insofar as flooding is concerned.
David Goodhue.
Certainly the fire service and other emergency services learnt a significant amount from such events. Firstly, we've learned to work with partner agencies for predictions, flood warnings, etc. Therefore, we forward deploy elements of equipment now and personnel should an event be planned or a flooding event be planned. When it comes to Scottish Government's involvement, they have purchased and supplied various equipment throughout Scotland now to actually deal with large floods. The fire service assets have increased considerably in the last decade, and that is predominantly because of Scottish Government's money, and they've funded those particular assets that we have. Training has increased. I think joint training has increased greatly as well, so that the Category 1 responders and Cat 2 responders and voluntary agencies also work together to establish a sensible solution in dealing with a problem as and when it occurs. And that is ongoing as we go forward. I think with the amalgamation of the Scottish Fire and Rescue Service and the police force, we're now reviewing assets and once again ensuring that the assets that were in place, we are now aligning completely with the risk. So we look at SEPA plug plans, etc., and actually make sure that we have the right resource in the right place at the right time. But that is an ongoing issue, and the amalgamation of emergency services has invigorated that and let us take another look at that to make sure we are correct.
Well,
can I welcome the comments that you've actually just made? Someone complimenting the Scottish Government for giving them more money. Can I maybe come in with the second question, or basically the point you've made? What other emergency responses in Scotland should be anticipated as a result of climate change, and how advanced is our planning and preparedness for them? And this is actually aimed at SEPA. Do you agree that most councils actually are not emptying gullies often enough? If you go down a street and you see a drain, it's not been opened for a number of years. If you see the silt built round it, and some councils don't have the assets that Fire and Rescue have just said that they have. They don't have enough gully emptying lorries. In fact, some councils only have one for a whole vast area of council area. Thank you, Chair. Convener.
I can't really comment on how many lorries the local authorities have. I'm sorry, I haven't got that information. But I think a more general comment about flood management. I think the Flood Risk Management Act has fundamentally changed how we address flooding and flood risk. It's a plan-led approach, it's sustainable, and it's risk-based. So we should be able to look at where the biggest risks are. So SEPA published its National Flood Risk Assessment a couple of years ago, and it's about to publish the new Flood Risk Hazard and Risk Maps, which will then identify where the biggest risks are expected and what those impacts are going to be. And we'll go on to develop the risk management strategies in 2015, and then you'll get your flood risk, the local authority flood risk plans. And at that point, and already it's happening, the local authorities are planning, but you start to identify where are those biggest risks within a local area, and what actions need to be taken. So it's a planned, it's a risk-based approach where you put your money where the biggest challenge is. So it might be that one local authority should have 16 gully emptying lorries and one should have one. It just depends on what's the impact, what's the infrastructural impact, what's the risks to communities and people's homes, etc.
Graham Day with a comment on that answer just now, and then we'll bring in Andrew.
Right, thank you, Convener. Just to back up Richard Lyle on this point, because if we're not properly utilising the existing infrastructure which allows us to minimise flooding incidents, or it may be small-scale flooding incidents in an urban setting, that's a pretty poor starting point, is it not?
I think that's absolutely fair, and in the, as I understand, what will be in these risk management strategies will be easy win-wins, easy things that you can do that already that infrastructure is in place. We're not talking about major flood defence developments necessarily. You're talking about actions that you can take locally that could alleviate the impacts of flooding, for sure.
Andrew? This is really going back to the previous question, and including insurance now, if you like, as part of the emergency services, which they do get involved with. Just a couple of points. In the Royal Society of Edinburgh inquiry, we found that insurance for the poor, or availability of insurance, or purchase of insurance by the poor, was actually going in a reverse direction to what the Scottish Government intended. They wanted more people to be protected by insurance. We found it was going in the reverse direction. So the poor are spending their money on other things, and so they are not protected by insurance. It's certainly been found by insurers in every event that the small businesses come out very badly because they tend not to cover themselves for things like interruption. And that's one feature of the whole framework of Climate Ready, that it doesn't seem to get into the bits that the other, it doesn't reach where the other beers don't go either. The 2020 initiative, for example, is all about big business. It's not really about small businesses. So I think there needs to be a lot more attention to small businesses. And the final point I wanted to make, and without being too controversial, there are big changes coming along on flood insurance. If Scotland becomes independent, then that is going to have major implications, because in the new setup, the government of the UK is going to be taking a position behind the insurers to enable flood insurance to continue. So if Scotland becomes independent, that will not be there. So the Scottish Government will have to look at that, and that will be quite an issue, because providing insurance from a smaller country is always much more expensive proportionally, because you can't spread the risks over such a big area. Those are some points.
It's noticeable that the UK government is hedging its bets by making this a 5-year plan for flood So I think the questions about what is sustainable and not we might leave to another committee. But your points are well taken. We have Jane Baxter.
Thanks, Convener. Just a brief question. I couldn't agree more that householders and small shops, this is a particular issue in parts of my constituency, just can't get insurance, and the premiums are so high, and it's because of the repeated incidents of flooding. But one of the driving factors behind that is the fact that drains and culverts are collapsing all over the place, and so I'm wondering what role Scottish Water plays in this, and the investment that's available to them to make improvements and to stop repeated incidences of floodings in the same parts of streets, in the same shops. Nobody will rent those shops. Businesses are vacating town centres because it floods, and it's not, well, it may be because of climate change, but it's more because the drains have collapsed. So is there a role for Scottish Water? Where do they fit into all of this?
Are you going to be a spokesperson for Scottish Water, Alec Ferguson, or are you going to wait?
No, I was just trying to get your eye for a supplementary question.
Yes, indeed, for sure. We don't have, we do, nobody from Scottish Water here, actually. So that's one for us. Yes, please do.
Maybe can say a little bit, I guess. Obviously, SEPA works very closely with Scottish Water. We've been working with them in their new phase of quality and standards investment over the next several years. And we've been working with them closely on some of the research projects they've been doing, looking at climate change studies, understanding the potential impacts on their infrastructure. And so there's quite a lot of recommendations about more monitoring, about looking at more vulnerable areas where there are vulnerable water resource zones as well. So I think they have got quite a lot of work that they're doing. You may want to go back to them and get a written response, but I reckon that they recognise that issue, and we of course work with them around sewerage flows as well, where you might need to improve that in certain areas where there's flooding.
That's very helpful, Convener.
Good. We'll bear that in mind. Alec Ferguson first. Yes.
Yeah, I just wanted to a small point, which I don't know if anybody wants to comment on or not, but those of us who still get a perverse pleasure from sort of canvassing and leafleting as part of our duties cannot help but have noticed over the last 10 years a huge rise in what I call the concrete garden in urban surroundings, and I can't help but feel that must have had some implications in terms of drainage and flooding and the sort of issue that Dick was talking about. And I just wondered, very, very briefly, if there is any work that has been done that gives a measure to that impact, and whether anybody's got any ideas on how it might be mitigated. If it is a measurable thing. If it's not, then I won't pursue it.
Can I have Chris, please?
Certainly, I think there has been work done on that. I'm not sure where it is, but I've read various bits about that in the past, particularly about bigger urban settlements. London, in particular, have got problems with that, which increase parking for cars and things. So it is a very live issue. And I know SEPA were doing work through their SUDS programme to sort of encourage people to use more sustainable drainage measures, things that will infiltrate the water into the system and hold it for a bit. So it is an issue. I think you're right, but I'm not sure where you pick up on the actual data about that. Thank you.
Okay, Stephen first of all, and then Anna. Right.
That point a bit further, not necessarily about the gardens being designed in terms of concrete, but you mentioned about car parks. It's probably the case now you'll find more car parks actually being used as artificial ponds. So the construction of car parks are incorporated in urban SUD systems. And that's certainly what we're finding in the built environment, is that the opportunity where new car parks arise, you can actually use that to hold and manage the water in a more practicable way. So just because it's concrete there doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to lead to a flooding issue.
And Anna?
Thank you. Yeah, just I'm not aware of any specific research here in Scotland in terms of quantifying the amount of permeable surfaces that are made impermeable every year, but certainly just to back up what Chris has referred to in terms of research elsewhere, I certainly know and I'm aware that this is a huge issue in London, and an area the size of Hyde Park is paved over with impermeable surfaces every year in that city, and I would imagine that kind of trend, to a different extent, is also consistent in urban areas of Scotland. And it does flag up, I think, this important challenge around the need to build more resilient cities and urban spaces being around a multifaceted approach, where having permeable surfaces is one action that makes a really important contribution to reducing overall flood risk. And sometimes it's difficult to quantify the exact nature of those contributions, but nonetheless, it's a really important principle that we need to support. There needs to be support to actually allow that to happen in reality, how we can reverse this trend and ensure that permeable surfaces are implemented, I think is important.
Thank you. First of all, we had Paula on this point, and then Graham Day with a supplementary on transport.
Yes, again, I can't put my finger on the data, but it is an issue for sure, and SEPA has been working with local authorities, with planning authorities through planning guidance to try and improve uptake in development. So it's quite hard when an individual decides to put tarmac in their drive, but there are ways to encourage it otherwise. But working with developments, working in public and private and business developments as well to encourage better sustainable urban drainage. And there's a good example, I think, for the Commonwealth Games. I think it's Scotstoun, is it, where they're having this swimming event. They've got a permeable car park, which is part of their urban drainage. So
thanks for the example.
Following that one
Graham Day, with a short supplementary.
Thank you, Convener. Just directed at what Stephen Thompson was saying. I'm very interested in the example you were giving about new build car parks. I'm wondering, is there any statutory requirement at all for people who are providing a car park to do that? And if there isn't, should we be looking at something along those lines?
I'm not too sure it's statutory requirements. And I know from the infrastructure that we have to build in the transport sector, we have to follow set standards. In our case, it's a design manual for roads and bridges, and they quite clearly state what we have to do in terms of managing water in such systems. So I think it's fair to say that within the buildings and infrastructure, you will have set standards to follow, and they absolutely take account of drainage design and incorporating the management of water.
Claudia Beamish.
Thank you. I've got a very specific question in relation to flood management, which is it's referred to in the adaptation plan. It is about the study of the impact of flows on sewage networks, and I wonder whether SEEP or anyone else could comment on that, because obviously in flood situations it's a deplorable situation if there are floods to our sewage systems, and indeed whether the system is resilient enough, and I hate to mention the word money, but whether more money or research needs to go into this.
Nobody wants to answer that question. Yes, there is. Paula's going to answer that question.
Seepa's here. I guess, yes, as I intimated before, in some of the work that we've been doing with Scottish Water, of course, includes looking at the impact of flows and sewage network, as is mentioned in the adaptation plan. So it is part of, it will be part of the flood strategy and ultimately the flood plan for that local area in terms of the sewage flows, and probably would require some investment, I think, in certain areas. Yep.
Can we just stick with the insurance business just now, because we had some questions later. Angus MacDonald wants to develop that point just now.
Yeah, thank you, Convener. I was interested in Dr. Lugalewski's comments on insurance, and as the panel will be aware, the issue of flood insurance has received considerable coverage in the Scottish media and certainly within Parliament, including a debate just before the summer recess. Now, the Environment Minister, Paul Wheelhouse, has actively engaged with the UK Government and the Association of British Insurers to develop a memorandum of understanding to cover the interim period until Flood Re is implemented. In addition, the recently departed UK Minister, Richard Bennion, reported that the insurance industry have committed to continue to make flood insurance available to those areas in high flood risk. So it's already been touched on by Dr. Lugalewski, but I'd be keen to hear the panel's view on to what extent householders and businesses in Scotland in flood risk areas are likely to face challenges in securing adequate insurance cover in the coming years.
Well, I'm not speaking on behalf of insurers as such, but I have followed it very closely. I think there is no doubt that they are going to be facing more difficulty because insurers now feel that they have to price the risk according to the situation of the actual building. Whereas in the past, there's far more a view that you could just cross-subsidise. The reason why it has changed is because a lot of new competitors have come into the market, and so they feel they can just pick off the properties which are not liable to flood insurance and undermine the ones like General Accident or Aviva or Royal National Alliance, which have got large numbers of people that are prone to flood insurance. So the ones that have got the flood risks now feel that they have got to respond to that challenge, and they must start to price the good risks cheaper, which means that the other risks must have their prices going up. So there's no doubt that there definitely is going to be a challenge. It will be gradual, but as I said, if Scotland becomes independent, it will become quite a significant issue. I mean, a very significant issue, because if the flood solution materialises, then Scotland might have a challenge in developing an alternative to that because of the scale of Scotland compared to the UK. You've got 5 million versus 65 million. It's quite a different proposition to put up a reinsurance company for that. I've already said that the poor and the small businesses, I think, are the places where the most pressure is going to arise. And for the poor, there are possible solutions. Insurers are willing to give cover if the local authority is willing, or the housing association is willing to work with them. The problem has been that because the social housing has tended to move from the public sector to the private sector, the private sector hasn't been quite so interested in working with insurers to set up schemes to give cover with rent, because that's the most effective way of doing it. You just include the insurance with the rent, and it's very, very cheap. There's no selection against the insurer, and insurers are fairly relaxed about that kind of arrangement. But the managements of these social housing associations don't seem to be quite so interested in pushing that. The small businesses, that is an issue. And I think that runs through the whole of the Climate Ready framework, that there's not enough attention to that sector. They don't understand climate change, they don't understand what they can do about it. More and more the insurance market is going towards just pick up a phone or do it on the internet, and so you're not getting quality advice about what to do. So I think there needs to be more resource pushed along that avenue, whether it's through the medium of trade associations or chambers of commerce, but they don't really seem to be part of the strategy at the moment, and that might be a way of doing it.
I'm intrigued by your comment regarding the cross-subsidy. I spoke in a debate in Parliament prior to the summer recess, and in some of the research I did, Rob Edwards of the Sunday Herald, for example, had stated that Scots were subsidising insurance in England. So, you know, it clearly works both ways.
Well, that may be true for Scots as a whole, perhaps. I haven't seen the figures, so I wouldn't like to comment. I mean, certainly England has been much less good at managing flood risk than Scotland. So all credit to Scotland and the Scottish Government, you know, that we have had good rules in for much longer than England now. So the problem has not got worse as fast as it did in England. But there are certainly parts of Scotland, and you heard earlier about the coastal regions where there are, you know, severe problems from sea level rise, for example, as well as rain. So there are certainly parts of Scotland, and the northeast of Scotland is one area I think that insurers are a bit nervous about.
Is that the case that you know, there's been huge amounts of building in floodplains down south in England, and indeed that's a huge contributory factor to the question about what insurance will cost?
Building in the floodplain is risky, but if you have got very good defences, as London has, then it is viable and justifiable. But personally, I would recommend against it, but sometimes there's no alternative. There's no other land, so you've got to develop it and you have to protect it.
I think we'll be discussing the built environment just to follow this on in a minute, but just to come back to climate change as such, in addition to flooding, what other emergency situations in Scotland should be anticipated as a result of climate change, and how advanced is our planning and preparedness for these? David.
I think what's come as a, should we say, a surprise to some of the emergency services over the last decade or so, when we looked at the initial global warming, we were under the impression that perhaps it was going to get hotter or colder, so therefore floods would be the problem, or wildfire would be the problem. And we started to push resources, certainly within the fire service, into flooding assets. What's happened though is we've found that there's an extreme variation in events. That is from hot to cold, freezing, etc. And the emergency services have to respond to all of it. Not only to the event itself, if it's a wildfire, if it's a large amount of snow or ice or flooding, we have to not only respond to the particular instance that's caused by the event, i.e. wildfire, but also business as usual. So we're still expected to go to everyday business as usual, house fires, people trapped in cars, following collisions, etc., even if there should be 3 feet of snow on the ground. So therefore we've had to push resources, certainly in the Cat 1 responders, over a number of years now. When we look at purchasing vehicles, a vehicle replacement strategy lasts from 12 to 15 years. So a 5-term, sort of short-term strategy you'll only get the benefits for 5 years. When we purchase vehicles now, we look for 4x4s, we look for diff locks on rear axles, etc., to ensure that fire appliances can still get to the incidents, should there be flooding, should there be snow, etc. Even things like rerouting exhaust pipes. We make sure that exhaust pipes are above, I think it's 18 inches, to ensure that our fire appliances can drive through 18 inches of water. All these things have to be taken into account. When we look at the strategic planning for the future, even this week, wildfire units are going on the run at various stations, fire stations throughout Scotland. We're just coming into November, and we're already thinking about wildfires not for just next year, but the next decade. So we certainly are increasing the number of specialist assets, Cat 1 responders, that is, fire service and police service across Scotland, in anticipation for extreme events. And I think that will continue over probably the next 5-6 years. We're trying to future-proof it for the next 2 decades, really.
Chris, please. Chris, yes?
Local authorities, and I think Transport Scotland as well, to a greater or lesser extent, have been affected by other issues such as subsidence and road slippage, which I think has we have quite a big impact in South West Scotland on some of the roads running across the uplands. Some of the rest of them, be thankful, always seems to be in the news with another landslip and another closure. So it's the increased intensity of rainfall has had quite a major impact on the soil cohesion, I guess, and the way that some of these roads are built. And I think that will be an increasing problem for the future, to maintain connectivity between settlements and avoid some massive detours and things.
And Stephen, please.
I'd say there's 3 principal risks that we're facing in Scotland just now. The first one, obviously, is flooding. It's been mentioned. We've had landslides very recently, and in fact this month at the West, and be thankful. And the third one is high winds, which I think it was either last year or the year before that we had particularly high winds in winter in Scotland. So those are the 3 emergencies that we would probably say that we want to focus on, at least from a transport perspective. What are we doing about it? Well, the biggest asset that we have just now is the new traffic control centre at the Queensferry Crossing, which has the capability to take in the emergency responders, the Met Office, the operating companies. So in terms of an asset that we can use to maintain our assets, that's probably the strongest that we have at this point in time.
And Gavin Hewitt.
Connectivity is extremely important, obviously, for our industry, and I'd just like to emphasise that the preparations which are being made, but the closure of roads with snow or ice means that you actually can't transport most of the product that we make up and down the country, and that is absolutely vital for our success.
I was just going to make a point before Anna comes in about having maps available for industry about the roads and rail routes that are affected by flooding, as well as likely closures because of snow and so on, because clearly it's very welcome that the whisky industry is using more rail transport from Elgin, which we welcome, therefore less road use at that point. But it's important that the public knows better about what areas are most likely to be affected. They may know their local one, but when you're travelling, you need to know much wider than that. Stephen Thompson.
I agree with that. I think there's 2 forms, using the traditional media and then social media. We've learned certainly since 2010 that we need to and have invested in our website. We've invested in internet radio through Traffic Scotland. Like I say, we've set up the traffic control centre, and perhaps using more modern forms of communication like Twitter to get instant access to the general public, because they want to know at that point in time what the risks are. It can tie that into the existing infrastructure that we have, like vehicle messaging systems, and that can tie into, for example, we've got the new traffic systems that's been set up with round about the 4th replacement crossing for variable speed messaging. So we are aware that we need to be communicating on a live basis with people on these networks.
Anna Besic.
Yeah, just wanted to raise the issue around heatwave planning. There is a national heatwave plan for England. The catalyst for the production of that plan was a massive heatwave that hit Europe in 2003, which resulted in around 50,000 excess deaths, including around 4,000 in the south of England. And that provided a catalyst for heatwave planning for England. We've not had that trigger event here in Scotland, and sometimes it's kind of hard to imagine that event happening. I fully acknowledge that, but we're living in a time when we're suffering, we're seeing climate extremes, and I think we just need to, it's already a proposal within the adaptation programme, and I do think we need to consider seriously the timing of the development of work to maybe better understand what risks we might face, what risks there will be to health and well-being, and that includes risks associated with cardiovascular illnesses, with respiratory disease, particularly in cities, perhaps where there are air pollution issues. It's not an issue that's going to go away, and I think we do need to consider, as sort of obscure as it might sometimes feel, what the seriousness of the implications of a heat wave here could mean for people's health and well-being. Because we're not used to these kind of events, our tolerance and comfort thresholds are much lower than elsewhere. So recent research in Glasgow suggests that comfort levels may be around 18 degrees. We had temperatures in excess of 30 degrees in the centre of Glasgow this summer, and I'm sure that was the case in other locations as well. So it's just to think about this as an issue that should be on our minds.
For that. Gordon's contribution here?
It was just a short point to come back to the discussion already. If you look across some other countries' adaptation plans, and I'm thinking also of the UK adaptation plan, a big component of that is about supply chain risk for business. And you know, we might be able to get the country working from day to day, but if the airports and other connections internationally are not kind of organised, if the kind of telecoms infrastructure is not working, if some other adaptation events are occurring elsewhere and it impacts the supply chain risk for companies in Scotland, then that's a major concern. So it's probably something that maybe the framework, the plan that we're developing in Scotland could go a wee bit further on.
Okay. That's good. Jim Hume, I think, probably.
Yes, thanks, Convener. We've already heard from David Goodhue a little bit about sort of planning his own organisation has to do regarding climate change and the effects it could have on their emergency services. But I'd be interested if any of the panel knew a bit more about some of the critical services, such as NHS, ambulances, etc. Service, if they're taken into account and incorporating into their plans for the future potential climate changes.
It's required, yes. Somebody to answer that now? Chris?
On behalf of the ambulance service, for example, within Scotland now there are a number of voluntary organisations that offer specialist attributes and specialist resources. It may be at charge, it may be at cost, etc. If you take the Scottish Ambulance Service, in recent years they have certainly been investing in their fleet to ensure they've got a greater 4x4 capability. They've also looked at partnerships with some of the voluntary agencies that can also offer the same type of resource and asset for them. So rather than have vehicles that are effectively redundant all year waiting for flooding, waiting for snow, etc., then go into partnership with the agency. They have specialist resources, and they bring them in as and when, and that seems to have worked very, very effectively in parts of Scotland, certainly within the in and around the city areas and some of the urban areas.
Chris? Yeah.
Just quick, as part of research, I was speaking to our resilience team, and what was interesting is we're now looking at a much more regional approach. It partly reflects the changes to the police and fire and rescue service, so we're working with our neighbouring authorities, and I suspect that's probably the same in a lot of Scotland. So there is a move to look at climate change as being a risk and a resilience issue we need to deal with, and starting to adapt to that on a much more regional basis. But on a more pragmatic level, in terms of things like 4x4 accessibility, it's interesting to see the use of things like local mountain rescue teams to provide that service to augment what exists for the existing health service, ambulance services. I drove past must have been an exercise going on locally at the weekend, and the ambulance service there, the police, and so everybody's working together on that. So I think it is starting to happen.
We're also seeing, I think, farmers working with the local councils to clear roads. You know, it's another regional activity, obviously, in rural areas. Paula?
A related point really on what Anna was saying about the temperature increases, which is potentially one of the other effects that we might get. And one of the things that SEPA raised in our response to the climate adaptation programme was there wasn't much mention on the heat island effect. So the effect you'll get in urban areas where you'll get the buildings heating up and emitting heat, so you create this kind of heat island. And there's an opportunity here, I think, for that multiple benefits approach to addressing issues from changing climate, is that you could put in green infrastructure which has that ability to cool down the area because of the nature of the plants. You could also address air quality issues which might get worse, an issue for the health service. And also at the time, you might put in some green infrastructure that will help in flood attenuation as well. So it's a brilliant example of that multiple benefits approach, but addressing that potential heat island issue that might come.
Okay, from the heat to the cold.
Yes, Convener, just to build on Jim Hume's question, because I think Jim talked about the emergency service, but for me, the emergency services also include those organisations and individuals who are responsible for restoring power supply in examples of severe weather. And I think we don't have to look too far back to the incident in Arran, which was extremely serious and over a sustained period, and where resources had to be deployed from all over Scotland, and I think to work round the clock to get the power back on. So I wonder what future planning contingencies there for these sorts of incidents, particularly given we may have more of them, they may actually be more severe in future. So where does that sit in the grand scheme of things?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, and one of the things I would say from the power sector's point of view, I mean, it was SSE in Arran, not ourselves, but in Scottish Power, but the industry works very much in cooperation around these issues. And if I go back to 2008, the industry as a whole asked the Met Office to look at various scenarios for how weather was going to change over the next decades. And at that stage, it was looking at what are the temperature effects going to be on power stations, what are the water scarcity issues going to be on similar stations, what are the effects of flooding that we've just discussed. And there's a whole range of different things that the power industry has to take into account. Now, on the grid side, the Met Office study back in 2008 also forecast more stormy weather, higher temperatures, and at that stage, the industry got together to look at how can we better prepare for a future that this is going to be more prevalent, as you suggest. And one of the things I can put before the committee is a report that we did in 2011, which sets out some of the issues that we're managing around this area, and some of the others in industry are looking at, and that goes through the whole gambit of adaptation issues and about how the industry is responding to events. And I'll go back to the point I made earlier, which is the three components that we look at through on a day-to-day basis, are about how we can, as an industry, how we can monitor what's happening in terms of the weather and the impact on our assets, and how we can manage operationally our activities in order to minimise any disruption. That's one thing. The second thing is about making our assets more resilient, so strengthening and reinforcing where we can, particularly in areas where we've had some kind of frequency of storms and such like. And the last area is when we are designing new infrastructure, that is built into the design process, so that for the future, it's got a kind of stress test already factored in.
I think that's very welcome to hear that the industry is actually being proactive and trying to do this itself rather than sitting back or waiting for government funding. It's encouraging to hear that.
Anna, Bessick, did you have a point there? Or right, well, I need to try and get this section summed up, because we're needing specific points, in the adaptation programme that relate to contingency planning, if you think there are specific points that we should be emphasising, you know, to sum up this particular session, because it's got a very wide range of different aspects, as we've found out, in a few words, what should we be saying to the ministers when we make our report?
I think for me, certainly it has to concentrate on partnership working. I think that any event, whether it's extreme weather or otherwise, we've now started to notice a fundamental difference in the way in which the responders deal with it. No one agency can deal with anything anymore, and I think in the past we've almost put things into pigeonholes. It's their problem. Extreme weather isn't anybody's problem, it's everybody's problem. And I think that if we don't take a unified approach to it and look at real joined-up working, real partnership working, testing and training, that links into the SCG arrangements going into the RRP arrangements later on this year, if we don't link this particular problem into those forums and don't take a united front, I think that we will fail in the future. So for me, that it is partnership, partnership and partnership.
Hola, yes.
Absolutely agree with that. My other point I was going to make was about data sharing. I think we should do that as much as we can. Obviously there are schemes already in place, but SEPA and other organisations, I think it's incumbent on us to try and share that information that helps us plan to avoid some of these events that we're talking about just now.
I think we'll try to move on to the built environment now. Nigel, Don, hello there.
Convener, yes, there is still light at this end of the table. Thank you very much. Actually, Gordon McGregor has helpfully already started to move in this direction, because he was just discussing the power industry's concern about their particular assets and the locations of those assets. And I'm also conscious that we've already heard about flooding, and we're kind of expecting good maps from SEPA more or less imminently. But I guess there's a general question, which is how well we're able to quantify the risks due to climate change on a geographical basis, in other words, in specific locations. To what extent can we put those general issues on maps?
Right. Who's going to be the map maker? See, I'm old-fashioned, you know. Instant information for people is important, but if you want to actually invest in dealing with particular choke points or whatever, they need to be mapped. We've got flood maps now, which are well organised, but there are other kinds of maps that I think Nigel's talking about.
Yep. Let's put some flesh on it and see if we can tease this out. I mean, if I were to ask the power engineers, they would be able to draw me a map of every power line. They would be able to tell me the wattage, whatever ampage, whatever it is, could go along it. You could show me the system. It would be there, and you would know where your choke points were. Equally, I'm sure we're going to get the choke points for natural flows of water through floodplains, you know, and rivers. We're going to get that pretty soon. Is there a map, this is maybe for Transport Scotland, is there a map that shows the risk of every major road in Scotland in the context of flooding, in the context of high winds, the risk of landslip? Because if there isn't, maybe there should be. Is there a set of maps of likely highest winds, for example, which will tell us something about damage to property and goods, and cattle and whatever? To what extent do we actually know on a general level where the risks are? Please.
I'll answer that in two parts, if you don't mind. The first part is we do have maps within our GIS system. Are they complete? I don't think so. So we're beginning that journey. There's actually two actions within the adaptation programme. I think it's B19 and B211, which specifically touch upon the need for more data built into a GIS system, particularly related to high winds and flooding. So I think that the point that you make is very well made. I think the second part to that is the sharing of GIS-based information, whether it's in shape files or other forms of files, not just within Scottish Government agencies, but across Scotland to help build up what seems to be quite separate GIS systems within individual organisations, so that we all have the same information. That has to be key.
Anna,
Yeah.
first. Yeah.
I think actually the creation of maps to map vulnerability is relatively easy with the right data sets. What I think we also need to consider is not just the spatial impacts, but the impacts across systems, which are much harder to understand. So it's how an impact in perhaps a landslide or an impact on a highly vulnerable part of the road network that we could identify then has cross-cutting and cascading impacts across a much wider area that can't be captured by a spatial map. So I think we need to consider not only spatial mapping of vulnerability, but more a systems-based approach to looking at how impacts on the power network affect transport infrastructure, which affect business continuity. And I think that's it's really important that we develop a detailed understanding of that. That's one thing that we hope to progress through the Climate Ready Clyde project, but it's something that requires a lot of work, a lot of actual investment and time and energy from partner organisations to make that happen. So it is, again, reiterating the value of the need for partnerships to understand where we have shared risks on a systems base, as well as addressing location-specific risks.
Paula, John?
I just wanted to raise the project that we have on Scotland's Environment Web. Maybe many of you will be familiar with it, which is an EU-funded project supported by government, led by ourselves and partners, lots of partners, to try and have a one-stop shop for information on all sorts of things, actually. It's an asset that hopefully, after the project finishes in 3 years, will manage to continue to be a fantastic place where we can see that information that you're talking about, ready to hand. Data sets can be displayed on map type formats for whatever use is appropriate, actually, and to try and overcome, and part of the project is dealing with trying to overcome some of these difficulties in data not necessarily talking to each other, one set of data not talking to another, but that's some of the things that we're overcoming through the project.
Very good. Yes, Gordon?
It was I think the reason for hesitation to the initial question was because it's actually, there are so many things that one could map. And if I look at our industry, I've already talked about, the risk on wind, high winds, the risk on flooding, the risk on... We've also other risks like vegetation management, how fast, trees and other plants are growing around, power lines that need to be cropped in order to kind of keep the system with higher integrity. And the challenge is, where do you best kind of map, and where do you draw the line around maps? If I, don't create a pun, but so I think the truth in what or really the answer to your question is what Paul had said earlier on, is about how people are going to share data, and about how private companies like ourselves is able to share data with emergency services, and SEPA is able to share data with others. And I think that's a much kind of wider area, but it's a really fruitful area for the development of the adaptation framework.
Yes, indeed, I'm grateful for those comments. I think actually that you're probably right in the sense that much of this is about lines. Because one of the other issues that I don't think there's anybody here to speak about is trees growing next to railway lines and roads, which just get blown over and everything stops. And actually you can by and large look at that tree beforehand and say, well, if there's a high wind it will get blown over, why didn't we cut it down beforehand? Very difficult decision to make, but not one that was impossible to predict. I'm wondering whether anybody here can give us any clues on adaptations for existing buildings. Most of our buildings are going to be around for a very long time. Are we aware of examples of adaptations to major buildings which reflect an understanding of climate change and what might happen?
I'll give just one example, convener. Yeah. As a result of the very heavy, very odd climate conditions up in the northeast of Scotland 2 years ago, we found that our maturation warehouses, fundamental to the industry, were in fact needed to be reassessed because we actually had a number of roofs which actually fell in. We have now taken that message very clearly. That is one of our adaptated messages. We have to redesign some of our maturation warehouses to make sure that they are actually capable of coping with particular forms of ice formation and therefore snow building up on ice, not being able to actually come off. It's a very specific example, but it's how we can very happily actually take lessons and learn them for the future. We are, of course, an industry which has learnt a lot of lessons over the last 500 years. We've adapted beautifully, and we're going to continue to adapt.
Just in case you don't know what we're talking about, that's the bonds where the whisky matures. Yes.
Thank you.
Yes, Paula?
I think there has been examples. Unfortunately, we haven't got Historic Scotland here with us, and I think would be able to give us more examples. But there are examples, for example, of green roofs being put onto existing buildings, and I know Historic Scotland have actually tried that themselves, which has added benefits. It can attenuate water as well, and it can have a cooling effect and can adapt the building.
Dave?
Yeah, thanks, Convener. Can I look at the situation with new build? So we would have new build or infrastructure being located in areas of higher, indeed moderate flooding risk. To what extent are they being built to high levels of climate resilience? And I'm thinking about things like their impact in drainage, for example. Are developers being required to take account of what conditions may be 10, 20, 30 years hence when development's being sanctioned? And also perhaps in the supervision of new build, you know, permissions given to build, but to what extent do they then supervise so that we don't have slight changes being made to the development which have a very negative impact on neighbouring properties from a climate change perspective?
The local development plan process, there are requirements, and whether that's through SEPA and other people, to actually address water runoff on new developments. I know got new housing being built in Dumfries, it's got flood attenuation ponds built with it. M74, there's a series of runoff ponds right the way up the length of the revised M74. So I think that is increasingly an absolutely critical part of any development and design process, and is you won't get your planning consent unless you've got it sorted out. So assuming you've got your building control right, this should all be there and working.
But to be clear, it's great that that's happening, but is it being done with a view to what we know now is the likely usage of this, or are we talking about anticipating what it'll be 30 years from now? What's the sort of build around that?
I think it's a bit of a movable feast, because I think when we, even 10 years ago, I think I used to be involved in doing what would now be flood mitigation and things, but we didn't call it climate change because it was slightly different. But it is evolving, but I think people are starting to recognise as the data improves that flood return periods are probably increasing. So what would have been a 1 in 200 is now 1 in 100, and it's likely to get worse in the future. We certainly have a lot more in the southwest. The rainfall that's mapped, it is a lot more. We've had a lot more over, with this summer's exception. We've always been up to field capacity for the whole of the summer, which has been really, really difficult. So you don't have that sort of build up in fields to reduce things. So I think there is developing evidence, and unless we actually capture the evidence and start to build on that, I think it's a moving feast, but I think people are starting to recognise it, and I think that will get built into each iteration of a development plan as it comes on.
Dr. Gillespie.
I didn't manage to catch your eye when you were talking about mapping. Several points I wanted to make there. Insurers spend a lot of time mapping risks, and one of the important lessons that they have learned is never to trust one model. I know it's great to say, well, let's all use the same model, but insurers have found to their great cost or financial pain that one model is not good enough, that you need to have different views, and through those different views you then can take a decision, but in the fuller awareness, if you like, of the uncertainty which exists. One of the things that concerns me, for example, is that so much of the planning in the UK is done on the basis of what the Met Office says, and yet there's an easily accessible study which shows that the Met Office view of the UK climate, when you compare it with about 12 or 13 other models around the world, because everyone has to model the whole world to do their own bit, you can see that the Met Office view of the UK is that it's wetter and warmer than everyone else thinks it will be. So, just one example, if you base your view on one model, there's a strong chance that you're going to miss something. And insurers, someone made the comment earlier that, it's quite easy to do vulnerability. Well, I would say exposure rather than vulnerability, because again, what insurers have found is that once an event reaches a certain size, you get all sorts of ancillary problems kicking in, like pollution, lack of tradesmen, unavailability of materials, and so the costs, just go through the roof. I fully agree with what someone else said about system-based rather than just map-based, because there was a study done by PwC of the UK and its international sensitivity to climate change. But when I read that report, I realised that it doesn't say anything about Scotland's sensitivity to international implications. And you would need a separate study to do that, but you wouldn't come up with a map. Well, you might have maps, but it would be more of a systems diagram. And the final sort of point on mapping I want to make is, again, I think something that is not very explicit in the current climate-ready framework, and it relates to sea trade. There's mention of the Arctic Ocean opening up, etc. But I don't think there's any real investigation of the implications for Scotland. There will be maybe more trade coming into Scotland, but I envisage a huge increase in the volume of ships coming down the North Sea to get to Amsterdam and Antwerp. Enormous volumes coming round from Asia, trying to crowd down into the North Sea to reach there, rather than coming round the other way through the English Channel. So what are we doing to be ready for that? Because if you're talking about emergencies, that would be, my #1 unexpected emergency. I mean, insurers spend a lot of time thinking about what's the worst that could possibly happen, and then add on 10%. Well, to me, that would be the one to look for, would be the accident in the North Sea, because there will be a completely different North Sea in about 30 years' time to what we see today.
There's a whole lot of issues which I can recall from previous discussions where we're talking about climate change, where in fact an entrepot in Orkney and places like that, in the north of Scotland, to reduce the numbers of large vessels sailing in narrow seas. But, take your point. That is a very good example. Paula?
Yes, back to your last question about buildings. So at the moment, you'll know Scottish Government have just consulted on their national planning framework, the Scottish planning policies, again, which creates an opportunity to influence at a plan level on taking account of mitigation and adaptation. And SEPA have worked closely with a set of planning key agencies to ensure that that planning policy reflects that. And there are some very good examples. I think I mentioned already the TAY plan, who is an award-winning strategic development plan which has embedded climate change in mitigation and adaptation. And in some recent workshops that SEPA have been involved in as well, they've been identified the need for more training on specifically on adaptation aspects. So, and it is for the long term, so it's for the lifetime, as I understand, for the development. But I think you did make an interesting point about making sure that then happens through the whole chain of the process.
Christian.
And we've talked about new buildings, we've talked about other buildings, but there is an issue with the very much older buildings that I don't think we've quite got our act together in terms of insulation treatments and things like that. I know Historic Scotland do work on that, and we're actively going to try and do some research on a couple of buildings down in the southwest. But at the moment we have things like Green Deal, which may or may not have an impact on people's outputs, but we don't have prescriptions that work for buildings that were built pre-1919. So that is an area of research that's required. I know it sort of touches on mitigation as well as adaptation, but unless we get these buildings to work effectively, breathable walls, use of traditional mortars and things, and build the skill space up to do that within the building industry as well as specification industry, architecture, etc., I think we will have a problem, because the embodied energy in these buildings is really, really important. We need to keep that and the character, etc., within the landscape. So I think this is one issue where there is a gap there.
Kind of sum up this section, so if you have anything to say about it before we move on to several others, because time presses. How well does the draft adaptation programme address issues around the resilience of infrastructure in Scotland? That is the current draft adaptation. given the threats posed by climate change. How well is your reading of it? You would say, could do better, or you know, you don't need to necessarily go into great details, but we need to get some feel from you when you've looked at that to give us evidence just now whether we think there's more emphasis got to be made, whatever. Anyone want to start?
Just a small one, just to be
Yep.
said on planning. I think it could be strengthened in how we could use the planning process actually to embed adaptation.
Right. Yes.
Very quickly, there are a number of adaptation reports published by a lot of different companies in different sectors for the UK, and obviously I'm very familiar with the power sector ones, but there are others for water and other sectors, and I don't think that those which are going to be revised over the next few years and updated, those are adequately referenced. And I think it's just a simple kind of making sure that, you know, the very important issues in those at a UK level are brought into thinking in Scotland as well.
Okay. Anybody? Anna? Yes.
Yeah, just to say that I actually think that the built environment section of the programme is strong. I do think to lay down this challenge of the good progress that has been made in terms of new build is really positive to see. The fact that Scotland's been successful in minimising increased flood risk, as Andrew described earlier, is excellent. Our big challenge is retrofitting of the existing urban environment, including the kind of green and blue infrastructure that Paula referred to earlier. And I think we really need to think about how we can actually support the delivery of that, because we know it's needed, we know that it has multiple benefits. How are we actually supporting the implementation of that?
Fine, then let's try to move on to a transport subject now. So Jane, you may get a question.
Excuse me. I'm wondering, talking to Transport Scotland specifically initially, what work is Transport Scotland doing to anticipate the impacts of climate change on Scotland's transport infrastructure across the different transport modes?
The adaptation programme has been written not just for roads, but for all of the modes that we're responsible for. So it includes railways. We've had input from the ports, harbours and ferries and aviation. We've also had input in writing the adaptation programme from a member of Scots, who are the chief transport officers for local authorities. So the authoring of the draft adaptation programme just now has been, the intention has been to cover all modes rather than the traditional modes of road and rail. So that's what I would say as a starter for 10. I think it's fair to say also that this is not a new topic for us. We have actually been consciously working on adaptation for about the last 8 years. We started the, let me get the wording right, we started the Scottish Road Network Climate Change Study 8 years ago, and that's still ongoing, and that will be an evolving document that's now been interwoven into the draft adaptation programme. So what I would say is that adaptation is not a new topic. It's a new word, but it's not a new topic in terms of how we approach the management of transport infrastructure in Scotland.
Anyone else want to point on that just now? No? Okay. Yes?
What challenge does the uncertainty attached to future climate change projections pose in building in consideration of climate adaptation into large infrastructure projects that are designed to operate for decades? And how should Scotland's approach to adaptation address this? So that's broader than transport, that's about infrastructure projects in general.
It's a really good question. I would say that the first part to that is, maybe following on from what Anna had said, is that actually new infrastructure is being designed, is being climate proofed as we speak. So designers, civil engineers are incorporating future climate into new builds. The point that Anna made was the retrofitting of existing assets, whether it's buildings or transport. That's where the real challenge lies. And that's where the money has to be spent on the existing assets rather than embedding adaptation principles into new build. That's already happening.
Yeah.
No other points in that just now. at the moment then, businesses and the economy. So Alec Ferguson, please.
Thank you very much, Commissioner. Yes, I just wanted to highlight an aspect of the UK Committee on Climate Change's report on how well Scotland was preparing for climate change by just putting a question, particularly to business representatives around the panel. Because in that report, the Committee on Climate Change did identify some of Scotland's key economic growth centres, such as food and drink, leisure and energy, as being particularly vulnerable to climate change impacts. And indeed, in oral evidence to our committee, David Thompson of the Climate Change Committee on Climate Change said, "I do not see in how the objectives have been set out how issues around resilience of businesses and supply chains are dealt with." Now, supply chain has already been mentioned by both Gordon McGregor, and the importance of connectivity, I think, was highlighted by Gavin Hewitt in this debate. So I wondered if I could ask anybody who wanted to comment if they have any views on particular challenges that businesses in Scotland face as a result of the impact of climate change.
Gavin, please, yes.
Very happy to comment on that. We, as an industry, the Scotch whisky industry, have been looking at the whole processes of climate change challenges and climate change adaptation for a long time. But you'd expect that of us. Effectively, the whole process of everything from cereals, water, right through to getting our products out through the ports, there's almost every aspect of Scottish life which we're affecting. Communities which depend on us, the connectivity of the roads, the rails. We don't use air because it's usually rather too expensive to use air for heavy bottles, but the roads, rail, ports are absolutely essential. And therefore, in a sense, we have been working with the UK Climate Impact Programme and the Scottish equivalent for some years now. And if you go back to one of their own reports, they actually identify Scotch whisky as one of the sectors which has been looking at this. What we are doing is trying to bring all our members, and indeed people who aren't our members, a few who aren't our members, in together to look at the challenges which they face collectively and individually as companies, and to try to make sure that in their own business risks planning, they actually look at the issues which we're identifying, which they need to look at for the future, covering that whole spectrum of the business operation. One of our biggest challenges, though, I think goes back to a bit which was really, in a sense, more appropriate for the first session than this session, which is actually achieving a variety of barley which is resilient to climate change. We have very particular requirements. We have been doing a lot of research. We've been paying for a lot of research with the Scottish Crop Research Institute and with the Heriot-Watt University. But we think, again, there's a bit where Scotland is missing out on this. And I think we need to actually build up a centre of excellence for cereal development and cereal adaptation and resilience. And I think that is missing. Various people are doing it, but I don't think enough attention is actually being given centrally to this issue. We are a country, above all, which relies on our cereals for so many of our economic activities, and I think we would put the emphasis on barley initially, but certainly wheat as well, because we use wheat within our grain distilleries. So that's an area where I think we need to actually do more. But every single aspect of the Scotch whiskies industry's process, from the association through our members into the companies, is trying to actually look at the whole process of adaptation. What are the risks? What do we need to actually do? What we need to do, what we can do collectively, and what companies have to do individually in assessing those risks and build them into their own programming.
Can I have a little follow-up to that, Convener, which is slightly on a slight pet subject of mine? But is very relevant to this debate, and it's specifically put to the whisky industry, I have to say, and it's on the subject of draff as an animal feedstuff, which is very important in my part of Scotland, in the southwest, and there is increasing angst, if I could put it that way, that the whisky industry is following leads given by its political masters in terms of using draff and burning it as an energy-producing thing. Now, if that trend grows, a consequence of that is that you are then extending the food chain to the extent that this protein has to be brought in, has to be imported, basically, because there's no real substitute for it in this country. And I just wondered how the industry or as a sector, you balance that type of equation in carrying out one action to try to mitigate some climate change aspects, you are actually increasing the poorer aspects of climate change in other directions.
It is something which we do balance up very, very carefully. I think there are some facts and figures which are important, that Scotch whisky production is growing, which means that we're actually producing more draft every time we actually increase our production capacity. Secondly, there is a very, very large surplus of draff or animal feed in hard form, which is made available in Scotland. And we actually have to export most of our animal feed, whether it's in wet or in dry form. We don't export in wet, sorry, we export it in dry form. Effectively, we're very conscious of the southwest. It was also being raised in the northeast, but we are satisfied with work which we've done with the Scottish Government that in fact there is no real shortage whatsoever of draft for the husbandry industry and for animals, and we are very conscious that we need to balance that up in our use of draft for bioenergy and our bio-boilers, as well as making sure that the animals and the cows of Scotland are well fed with a high protein product.
The animals well fed and the people well watered in some respects, so I can't ask for much more than that, I think.
That's a very good question. Gordon?
Yes, thank you. It was mentioned earlier on, there was a PwC study undertaken, I think it was around 2010, by DFID in preparation, I think it was for Copenhagen. And it was what are the impacts that could occur for businesses because of kind of changes in the climate and need for adaptation. And it was quite comprehensive, but it was actually quite a good checklist to kind of go through. And it did touch on issues around markets and supply security, issues around costs, issues around how the discussions earlier we had around infrastructure would have, what impacts would happen in turn on community. So it's actually a good aid memoir for anyone who's working in this area in Scotland. There's also another useful source of good example for business, and the UN Framework Convention has got what they call a private sector initiatives website, and it lists out from a lot of different companies in a lot of different countries some of the things that they're doing in order to mitigate any risks around climate change and the need for adaptation. So it's well worth a look, and some leading international companies are involved, but also some small businesses and communities are involved in that venture as well. Insofar as it affects those sorts of issues affect companies in Scotland, I think it's hard to speak generally on that, and I think actually there's no substitute for going into the different sectors and individually going into the different companies for how well or otherwise they are prepared for changes in the climate. What I think the adaptation framework for the Scottish Government could do is I think it could actually help explore across those sectors which ones are well covered and which are not. I mean, I tend to think that some sectors in the big infrastructure area around transport and energy are pretty well aware of these topics. I suspect some other sectors are not as aware, but they could have a big impact on them down the line. And I think there could be a role for people like the CBI or other trade bodies to work with the Scottish Government to kind of expand that out. And I noted that wasn't in the framework, so there's maybe something there. And I also think earlier on, I think Andrew mentioned about small business. And I think that's a really critical area for adaptation. It doesn't just affect big companies, but it affects every single private entity across across our economy.
Yes, Stephen.
Yeah, I'll just follow on that point. I mean, from the transport sector's point of view, we've included a line in the draft adaptation programme. It's section B38, where we're encouraging transport operators to share information, and for us to share information with them, and that particularly business, public and private. Beyond the transport sector, though, I'd raise the issue of, do businesses have the right resource, the right skills to understand the risk that they're facing from adaptation? The word mitigation probably resonates with a lot of businesses, but the word adaptation, I'm not yet convinced that it's taken as seriously to businesses at the coalface. And just to finish off that point, I would say that we already have a resource in Scotland through Adaptation Scotland that provides some of the clearest, most simple language to explain what the risks are from adaptation. And it's certainly one that, from a Transport Scotland point of view, we've tapped into over the years that Adaptation Scotland have existed. But I think one of the biggest risks we're facing is whether the story of adaptation is actually understood by businesses, both large and small.
So, Anna, Andrew and Chris, in that order. Anna.
Yeah, I think it's been good to hear from the Scottish whisky industry, and that you're an excellent example of an industry sector that has understood and taken cognizance of the risks that climate change faces, and has developed a very proactive approach to responding. And I think that's a model that would be excellent to see applied across other industry sectors in Scotland. And it comes back to this partnership working. Adaptation Scotland has worked in partnership with the 2020 group to do pilot business adaptation planning with a number of infrastructure providers and business sectors, and that's clearly working through that process has enabled those businesses to identify in their language and in their terms the kind of risks that they face as a result of climate change and the actions that they may want to take forward to address those risks. Obviously that takes capacity, time to develop the kind of partnership working and projects that allow this evidence to emerge. Within the Adaptation Scotland programme, we have generic resources and advice that's available for businesses, which is of value and needs to be there as a basic set of information. We're continually trying to improve the kind of accessibility and the way that information is made available. But ultimately, we also need to see partnerships and investments in projects and initiatives that allow us to get a better understanding, in a similar way to the Scottish whisky industry have, for other industry sectors around what are the key risks. And also, I think, right at the beginning of our conversation today, a point was raised about kind of climate impacts impacts affecting the potential for businesses to have confidence to locate and operate in individual areas. And that's an issue that's prevalent internationally as well. When you look at leading commercial business centres like London, Rotterdam, Copenhagen, competing areas, you see that one of the reasons they're marketing themselves as climate-ready places is because they want to ensure that investors have confidence to invest and locate in those places in the future. And I think we should be positioning ourselves in Scotland to ensure that we are a resilient and a safe place for business to invest, and that can only happen if we have the realisation of this adaptation planning process. That's going to require partnership working.
Thank you. Andrew.
Yeah, I'll start by just underlining again the SMEs, which has already been referred to. I think that's absolutely critical, and to me it doesn't really feature in the framework at the moment. Linked to that, another group of people which I think are very important but are overlooked almost all the time are the professions. There's nothing about engaging professions, and I've struggled for years to try and get the insurance profession more actively involved and aware of climate change. And there's still a lot of scepticism, even amongst insurers, that climate change is real and it's caused by people. So there's other professions, the law, health, construction, finance. All of these people are advising businesses and individuals. And it's not just a matter of taking a code and saying, well, we must build it this way. It's a question of getting them to understand that, they must think more laterally about what they're doing, because the world will not be what they are experiencing today in 30 or 40 years' time, and they're giving advice to people that will be affected by that. So the professions, I think there's something that needs to be looked at there. Renewable energy is likely to be a very big sector in the Scottish economy, and there isn't a lot about that as an issue itself. And the renewable sector, strangely, although it's seen as a great mitigation tool, it's actually very vulnerable to the weather itself, because a lot of its resource is actually nature. It's whether it's the water, the wind, the sun. So there needs to be, I think there needs to be a lot more attention to that. The insurance sector is, there's basically not a Scottish insurance sector anymore. There are some life and pensions companies, but there's no general insurance companies anymore. They're all in London or actually owned overseas. So if Scotland wanted its renewable energy sector to be up and running in terms of dealing with the risks caused by the weather and the lack of resource or the over-availability of resource, then it seems to me that maybe someone, perhaps the Carbon Innovation Centre in Edinburgh, or someone should be taking that as an issue, a project to develop that and take that forward. And then finally, just to repeat my comment about marine, there's a lot of words about fishing, but I think the whole issue of the marine sector, and particularly trade, is going to be much, much bigger in future.
Thanks for that. And Chris?
A point, really, I suppose it's pushing Adaptation Scotland. When we started dealing with mitigation, we worked very heavily with Carbon Trust, who work with both public sector and private sector. And I think Adaptation Scotland are a resource that we really ought to make sure have the bodies to actually help deliver for both public sector and the private sector, because they're doing a really good job, but you're only a limited number of people. So we probably need to front load our development at this stage, because although adaptation is an interesting one, we've got some short-term cycles, but it's the generational impacts of it that are going to be really difficult to deal with, particularly given the sort of political cycles relatively short. So things we're going to have to do over 20, 40, 100 years. So we need to get that in place. So we may need, to front load the development of understanding, and I think Adaptation Scotland is probably very well placed to help develop that. Thank you.
Stephen?
Just a short point following on from what Andrew said about professions. Certainly in Transport Scotland we are looking for, and currently are recruiting now for engineers, and they require to be chartered. In order to gain or go towards chartership, you have to have an MSc. So I wonder if there's a route through the MSCs within Scotland to introduce the whole concept of adaptation, whether it's in engineers, whether it's in emergency planning, whether it's in healthcare, it doesn't really matter. I wonder if one lecture out of an MSc course in Scotland between now and this time next year could actually introduce that whole concept of adaptation. If you start doing that, you literally hit tens of thousands of people over the coming years that will be introduced to the concept of adaptation. And why I'm saying that, I'm actually doing a lecture at Heriot Watt tomorrow. But the reason I'm doing it is that the lecturer at Heriot Watt has gone out their way to find an industry professional to come in and talk to the MSc students about sustainability and adaptation. So that's fair play to Heriot Watt, but that's an easy route to get into the professions.
Very valuable connection there of these two things, I think. Well, we want to just to deal with a final subject which affects an awful lot of people, which is social justice and adaptation. So Claudia Beamish is going to lead on that one.
Thank you, Convener. It has been a long session, and this is a very important aspect of adaptation. It has threaded through, I would suggest, the whole of our discussions today, because we've heard about green infrastructure and air quality. We've heard about insurance, which the Joseph Rowntree Foundation highlights should possibly be, at least in some respects, a social good. And then we've also heard about buildings, and that obviously has a relationship to fuel poverty. And one of the sections in the climate adaptation draft programme is about home energy efficiency programme for Scotland and how that relates. I just want, if you'll bear with me, to highlight very quickly that the UK Committee on Climate Change report noted that 7% of Scotland's population live in remote rural areas, and 100,000 people roughly living on inhabited islands. And these remote areas are particularly vulnerable to disruption to transport, energy and water services. So I wonder if panel members have any comments on that particularly. And also the Joseph Rowntree Foundation has stressed that their disappointment, I think it could be said, about the adaptation policy focusing more on personal factors, such as health and age, and environmental features such as flood prevention, but that it also needs to address social factors such as income inequalities and the existence of social networks and social characteristics of neighbourhoods. And Glasgow is highlighted. We've heard quite a lot about partnership working, which in relation to all sorts of issues, and I wonder whether members of the panel today can highlight quite specifically what they would like to see in relation to social justice. And as our Minister for Climate Change and Environment, Paul Wheelhouse, stressed in a letter to us recently, actually this is a climate justice issue. It's not only the developing world, but we don't want to see a divided society here. And so I wonder whether people can comment on this.
All there in your question, but
sorry,
but fair enough. It's very welcome, Andrew.
I mean, I've already mentioned that insurance for the poor is an issue, and it seems to be going backwards rather than forwards. One point I think was made in the Royal Society of Edinburgh's report was that I think I'm right in saying that in some circumstances, people on the lower incomes are acknowledged to have a right, if you like, to be able to own a pet, which will then consume food, so that therefore their income has to allow enough to be able to feed the pet. And I would argue the same, that insurance is a social good, and that their income should allow them enough for a modest insurance premium, which is not allowed at the moment, and therefore they can't afford to buy insurance. I'm not saying insurers should be making a profit of exorbitant amounts. I'm just saying that if they haven't got enough money to buy the insurance, then forget it. If it's not allowed for as a notional amount. Now, they may choose to spend that on 2 pets rather than insurance, but that's their concern. But it should at least allow in the budget to buy insurance.
Okay, that point taken. Any other? Chris, yeah?
One of the issues that was raised when we were looking at the consultation was about water. Particularly about water supplies in remote rural areas. We've got probably thousands of properties where they're taking water off the hill, and whether it's increased rainfall, decreased rainfall, there's an issue. Whether it's cryptosporidium, problems with bugs in water, it is something that needs to be addressed. And I don't think it was as overtly addressed as it could be. And just on social justice and housing, probably best practice example, our local housing association now have fitted air source heat pumps to about 1.5% of our housing stock. I think the average savings for individuals, if they get assuming they manage them right, is about £400 or £500 a year, which has been a fantastic success story. So I think there are things you can do. Obviously, it's mixed with treating the houses for insulation, etc., etc. But there are things we can do which are having a really positive impact on local people's houses, and getting to the root of problems with fuel poverty, because I think that's we're an area that has 42% fuel poverty, so it's something we desperately need to get on top of.
Anna?
I just wanted to share with you a couple of experiences that relate specifically to supporting remote communities. I did some work in partnership with the Highland Council a few years ago now to pilot community-based adaptation planning in Gairloch. It was a very interesting experience to learn more about how that community perceived it may be vulnerable to climate change, and issues around the breakdown and disruption to infrastructure came through, the change in the natural environment, how that affected cultural values. It also highlighted the existing resilience of that community and the real, actually, strength within the community to be resilient, but highlighted that resilience was dependent upon critical services, local shops, and this local network of facilities, and that actually the breakdown in those facilities through for a number of reasons could compromise the future resilience of those communities generally, but in particular when you think about the additional issues they'll have to face with as a result of climate change. I think community adaptation planning is really important because the impacts of climate change are so localised that it's not a one-size-fits-all solution, but that takes, again, time and capacity to enable the expertise to come and to help communicate these issues in a way that's accessible for those communities. I don't know that necessarily provides any answers, but just a sense. The second point relates to delivering kind of social justice as part of the transformation of communities, maybe in more urban areas, and around this issue of how can we ensure that climate change is addressed alongside health and well-being and reducing health inequalities. And I think we need to look at taking opportunities to mainstream so that building resilience to future climate change impacts can be supported as a part of holistic community development, not as a standalone issue, because I don't think it's appropriate in every context for us to expect individual communities to prioritise adapting to climate change when they're facing such a wide range of other challenges. Instead, I think it needs to be made accessible as part of overarching processes to support transformation. And that, again, requires resourcing to actually make that happen in a way that's accessible for communities.
Gavin Hewitt.
Economic activity on the more remote communities or on the islands is essential, because if you have got businesses working there, businesses themselves will help deliver what is needed in terms of connectivity. I just used 2 examples. Isla, there's a huge amount of whisky distilling. We were not getting the sufficient number of ferries to actually deliver our goods or to take our stuff off the island. The very fact that businesses actually driving the agenda for the number of ferry crossings over from the mainland to Islay is absolutely critical and helps the community on that island. There are new distilleries being built in Barra and Uist. Those themselves will also, I think, therefore create a business demand. And once you get the community and the business demand working together, I think you have a very strong argument for some of the social justice things you're talking about.
Okay, well, if there are no further comments, that was a rather good upbeat note to end this particular long and detailed and wide-ranging session. And I'd like to thank our witnesses very much for your contribution. It is getting closer to your lunch than it is to ours, because we still have another item to deal with. So thank you for your contributions. They'll be taken into account. We need to clear the table fairly quickly. If there are points we need to follow up with you, we will do. But thank you for your contribution just now. And we'll restart as soon as we can. And we're moving on to agenda item 4. The last item, you'll be glad to know, the agenda today, which concerns petition PE 01441 by David Crichton on flood insurance problems. This petition calls on the Scottish Parliament to urge the Scottish Government to represent Scottish interests in the current discussions between DEFRA and the UK insurance industry, and I refer members to the paper which you have in front of you and invite any comments that you might wish to make. Dick Lyle.
Yes, Convener, I would agree with the recommendation that this petition be closed on the grounds that it's satisfied that the Scottish Government has ensured that the Scottish interests have been represented. In doing so, we could continue to monitor the flood re-scheme as part of our overall consideration of climate change matters, but I believe the petition should be closed.
Okay, any other comments?
Can I just say, I agree with that, but we might ask the Minister to keep us updated on any developments.
I think also to add to the record, when we talked about flood re, this 5-year scheme that the UK government has, we need to monitor that very carefully, because in terms of our adaptation discussions, we're talking about longer term planning and how it's going to be afforded. So it is important that we get the Minister, in fact, to have us kept up to date on this. That's fine. Okay, so we're agreed about that, and that therefore we should close the petition as it is, with the view to writing to the Minister to tell him and the petitioner of our views. Right. Thank you very much for that. Our next meeting takes place next week, and at that we have an evidence session on climate change adaptation and behaviour from the Minister, and consider 2 negative SSIs in the draft budget report to the Finance Committee as well. So that we look forward to, and thank you very much for your prolonged attention, and we will close the meeting now.